Majera, intoned Zorian, finishing the spell with the word he wanted the spell to search for. He felt the spell reach out around him, scanning the books in the surrounding shelves for any mention of the word in question, and poured some more mana into the spell to expand its radius. His efforts to overcharge the spell almost unraveled it, forcing him to spend several seconds stabilizing the spell boundary, but in the end the mana flow snapped into its proper place and the spell finished its task as planned. 7 golden threads flickered into existence, seemingly growing out of his chest and connecting him to various books in this particular section of the library. Zorian smiled. The spell was one of the book divinations Ivory had taught him, one that sought out books containing a specified word or string of words. It was a somewhat fragile spell, failing if the number of positive matches exceeded a certain number, the exact number depending on the caster's skill. It was mostly used to search for quotes or really exotic terms. Exotic terms like, say, the dead language of Majera. Xenomir hadn't been kidding when he had told Zorian that he wouldn't be able to find any books about it. There were no books specifically about the Majera language, and very few books even mentioned it. Up until now, he had only found 13 other books that contained the word, and most of them only in the form of a throwaway comment or two. It was possible that the knowledge he sought existed somewhere in the library, only in a format that was invisible to the divinations he was using. Ivory had only taught him the very basics of library magic, as she called it, so his searches were painfully crude in the grand scheme of things, but if that was the case, there was little he could do about it. He glanced down at the threads growing out of his chest and waved his hand through them, watching it pass through them without effect. He never got tired of doing that. Well, he probably would, in time, but the novelty hadn't worn off yet. The threads were an illusion, existing only in the privacy of his own mind. Every divination spell needed a medium through which it could present information to the caster, since it was impossible for human minds to process the raw output of a divination spell. A self-imposed illusion like the threads he was currently looking at was actually fairly advanced as divination mediums go, or so Ivory had claimed when he had tried to tell her he got the spell working within 30 minutes of being shown how to do it. He had a distinct impression she thought he was lying. He didn't really understand what was supposed to be so difficult about it. To be honest, the threads were a purely mental construct that didn't even require much in the way of shaping skills, just visualization. It seemed pretty simple to him. Natural even. He shook his head and followed after one of the golden threads till he reached a book it was attached to. It was a huge, intimidating, 400-page book about the history of Mycena, and Zorian had absolutely no intention of poring over it until he reached the tiny part that actually interested him, so he cast another divination Ivory had taught him. This one highlighted every mention of the chosen word, in this case Majera, in shining green, so he simply flipped through the book till he caught a flash of green. Zorian? What are you doing here? Zorian immediately snapped the book shut and stuffed it back on the shelf. While he wasn't doing anything forbidden, he really didn't want to explain to Ivory what Majera was, and why he was searching the library for any mention of it. The retort he planned to use died on his lips when he finally turned to get a good look on his visitor. Ivory was a mess. Her eyes and nose were red, as if she had been crying recently, and there was an ugly purple splotch covering her right cheek and neck. It didn't look like a bruise, not exactly, more like. Oh hell no. Ivory, he started hesitantly. You wouldn't happen to go in the same class as my brother, would you? She flinched back and looked away. He sighed heavily. Just great. How did you know? She asked after a second of silence. Brother Dearest came to me earlier today, said Zorian. Said he pushed a girl into a purple creeper patch and wanted me to make an anti-rash potion. I wasn't in the mood, so I kind of blew him off. That was a lie, actually. He had discovered, during the last 3 reverts, that Fortov was either unable or unwilling to track him down if he failed to return to his room after class. That was actually the main reason why he spent the entire day in the library instead of inside his room. Still, due to his rather unique situation, he knew what would have happened had he been present. Oh, she said quietly. That. That's all right. No, disagreed Zorian. No, it's not. If I had known he was talking about you, I would have helped him out. Well, helped you out. He can go die in a fire as far as I'm concerned. He paused for a moment, considering things. You know, there is no reason why I can't do it now. I'll just have to stop by my room to pick up the ingredients and dash. You don't have to do that, Ibury quickly interrupted. It's not that important. Zorian took in her appearance one more time. Yup, she had definitely been crying before. Coming here. Besides, her choice of words was conspicuous. She said that he didn't have to do it, not that he shouldn't, and that it wasn't that important, not that it wasn't. It's not really a problem, he assured her. The main reason I refused in the first place is because it was Fortov who asked, not because it was so difficult to do. Just tell me where to find you when I'm done. I'd like to come with you, if it's not a problem, she said hesitantly. I'd like to see how the cure is made. Just in case. Zorian paused. That was, potentially problematic. After all, the alchemical workshop would be closed down this late in the evening, and he would have to employ some, unorthodox methods of gaining access. But what the hell, it wasn't like she would remember this in the next restart. Thus they set off toward Zorian's apartment. Of course, having Ibury looking over his shoulder wasn't enough, so when he had finally reached his room he found another familiar person waiting for him. Specifically, Zack. He wasn't terribly surprised to see Zack waiting for him, to be honest. The boy had been getting steadily more nervous during their practice sessions as the summer festival approached, no doubt unnerved by the impending invasion. Not that he ever told Zorian about the invasion. Zack was stubbornly tight-lipped about that, regardless of how much Zorian tried to goad him into blurting out something. Over the last few days, his fellow time traveler had questioned him about his plans for the summer festival several times, not so subtly implying that staying inside his room would be a bad idea. As Zorian still remembered quite vividly how one of the flares flattened his entire apartment building when the invasion started, he was inclined to agree with Zack on that one. Unfortunately, Zack seemed to have trouble believing that Zorian was in agreement with him on that point. No doubt he came specifically to make sure, again, that Zorian was going to attend the dance. Zorian wondered. For God knows what time. Just what happened between Zack and his previous incarnations to produce this kind of impression. Had he really been that stubborn before the time loop? He walked up to Zack, who was sitting on the floor next to his door, completely oblivious to his surroundings while he concentrated on something on his palm. No. Now that he got closer he could see it was actually something above his palm. A pencil. Lazily spinning in the air above Zack's palm. Apparently Zack knew the pen spinning exercise too, and was currently practicing it while he waited. Zorian had a strong urge to throw a marble at Zack's forehead and demand that he starts over. But decided against it. Mostly because he didn't have any marbles on his person at the moment. Hello Zack, Zorian said, startling Zack out of his reverie. Are you waiting for me? Yeah, confirmed Zack. He opened his mouth to say something else but then noticed Ibury trailing behind Zorian and snapped his mouth shut. Air. Am I interrupting something? No. Not really, Zorian sighed. I just came to grab some alchemical supplies and then I'll go make something for Miss Ambercombe here. What did you want with me? It can wait a while, Zack said dismissively. What are you making? Maybe I can help. I'm pretty good at alchemy. Is there anything you're not good at? Asked Zorian with a snort. You'd be surprised, mumbled Zack. Ibury watched their interaction in silence. But Zack was a fairly sociable person. So by the time Zorian returned from his room with a box of supplies the two of them were engaged in lively conversation. Mostly about Ibury's current condition. Man. I didn't know your brother is such a jerk. Zorian, Zack remarked. No wonder you turned out to be such a, He trailed off when Zorian raised his eyebrow at him, daring him to finish that sentence. Ivory's reaction was more vocal. "He's not a jerk," she protested. "He didn't mean for this to happen. He should have fixed it." Though, Zack insisted. Intentionally or not, it was his fault. He shouldn't have dumped his responsibility on his little brother like this. "Nobody forced Zorian to do anything," Ivory said. "He's doing this out of his own free will." "Right. Zorian." "Right," agreed Zorian. "I'm doing this because I want to." He actually agreed with Zack, but chose not to say so. If he had learned anything about Ivory from spending an entire revert around her, it was that she had a massive crush on Fortov. No good could come from bad-mouthing him in front of her. Besides, if he was to be honest with himself, Zorian had to admit he was incapable of being objective about Fortov. There was too much bad blood between the two of them. Thankfully, the two of them quickly agreed to disagree on the topic, and a comfortable silence descended on the group. Well, it was comfortable for Zorian. Apparently Zack didn't agree. "Hey, Zorian," Zack said. "Why are we going towards the academy proper?" "So I can access the alchemical workshop." "Of course," said Zorian. He knew what Zack was getting at. Of course. But he was still hoping to get away without revealing one of his most closely guarded tricks. "No such luck." "But all the workshops are closed this late in the evening," remarked Zack. "Ah!" Ivory exclaimed. "He's right. They closed down 2 hours ago." "It won't be a problem," Zorian assured them. "So long as we clean up after ourselves. No one will know we were there." "But the door is locked," pointed out Zack. Zorian sighed. "Not to magic." "It isn't." "You know unlocking spells?" asked Zack in a surprised tone. Zorian understood his surprise. Unlocking spells were restricted magic, due to their obvious abuse potential. Unless you possessed a special license. Even knowing how to cast them was a crime. Not a particularly serious crime, but a crime nonetheless. Perhaps it was good, then, that Zorian didn't know a single unlocking spell. "No. I don't," said Zorian. "But it's just a simple mechanical lock. I'll just manipulate the tumblers telekinetically." "Piece of cake." They gave him a blank look. Like most people, they had no idea how locks actually worked, and how easy it was to bypass most of them. Zorian, due to his somewhat colorful childhood, did. In fact, he could pick your average lock without using magic at all. It was just a lot slower than his little magic trick and required him to carry around a set of lockpicks. He stopped in front of the door leading into the alchemical workshop and tried the handle. Like Zack said, it was locked. Shrugging, Zorian placed his palm over the keyhole and closed his eyes. He could feel Zack and Ivory cluster around him to get a better look at what he was doing, and did his best to block them out. He needed total concentration for this. He had developed this particular trick back in his second year, after he got bored of refining the standard shaping exercises they were given. It involved flooding the locking mechanism with his mana, using the resulting mana field as a sort of touch sight to get a feel for the lock, and then carefully moving the tumblers into proper position so he could neutralize the lock. It took him months of stubborn practice, but by now he was good enough at it to unlock most doors in 30 seconds or less, even warded ones. He didn't say this to Zack and Ivory, but the door he was trying to open was actually warded. Anything even remotely important in the academy was, including most of the doors. However, as Zorian quickly discovered when he experimented with the newly developed skill, low-level wards were very specific. They countered a handful of common unlocking spells, and nothing else. Zorian's little trick was not a structured spell, and thus didn't trip these rudimentary wards at all. The door clicked and Zorian tried the door handle again. This time the door opened without resistance. "Wow," said Zack as they all filed into the workshop. "You can open a lock just by pressing your hand against it for a few seconds." Zorian gave him a sour look. "It's a lot more complicated than that. That's just the visible part." "Oh. I don't doubt that for a second," Zack said. Still. While Zack seemed very impressed with Zorian's achievement, Ivory remained strangely quiet and kept giving him funny looks. This was why he hated telling people about his lockpicking prowess. Most immediately assumed he was some kind of a thief. Well, that, and he didn't want the Academy authorities to find out about his achievement. They would no doubt change their warding scheme and then he wouldn't be able to do what he just did. Fortunately, Ivory wasn't as condemning as some people Zorian met in his life, and got over her suspicions quickly once he started to prepare the salve. Strangely enough, Zack didn't know how to make one. Even though it was a fairly simple thing to make and Zack had demonstrated some mightily impressive alchemical work in class, he didn't appear all that interested in learning. Either apparently the Anti-Rash salve was too mundane for his tastes, and he was only interested in things like strength potions and wound-closing elixirs. That sounded like trying to build a house without bothering to set up proper foundations. But it wasn't Zorian who was a decade-old time traveler. Yet. "Aren't those purple creeper leaves?" Ivory asked, pointing at the small pile Zorian had placed on a wet piece of cloth. "Yes," confirmed Zorian, wrapping the leaves into the cloth. "They're the main ingredient, though they have to be crushed first. Alchemical manuals usually claim you have to reduce the leaves into powder, but it's not really necessary to go that far. You just have to use more leaves otherwise. But it's not like purple creepers are in short supply." An hour later, the salve was done and Zack was kind enough to conjure some kind of illusionary mirror so Ivory could apply the salve on herself right then and there. Kind and sneaky. Because while Ivory was busy with applying the salve on herself, Zack dragged Zorian away in the corner so he could talk to him in private. "So?" Zorian prompted. "What is it?" Zack reached into his pocket and pulled out a ring, which he promptly handed to Zorian. It was a featureless band of gold that reacted strangely when Zorian channeled some mana into it. "It's a spell formula," Zack said. "Magic missile," guessed Zorian. "That. Plus shield and flamethrower," Zack said. "Now you can use all three in actual combat." Zorian looked at the ring with newfound respect. There was only so much one could cram into a spell formula, and it was mostly dependent on the size of the item used as a base. Turning something as small as a ring into a spell formula for 3 different spells was a pretty impressive feat, even if they were relatively low-level ones. "Must have been pretty expensive," Zorian remarked. "Made it myself." "Actually," Zack said with a grin. "Still. That's a pretty valuable thing to give away to someone you've met less than a month ago," said Zorian. "Why do I get the feeling I'll be needing this in the near future?" Zack's smile disappeared and he suddenly became more subdued. "Maybe. I'm just making sure. You know. You never know when an angry troll might get a jump on you or something." "How oddly specific," noted Zorian. "You know. You've been getting steadily more nervous as the summer festival approaches. And you seem oddly interested in making sure I attend the dance. You will. Right?" Zack prompted. "Yes. Yes. I told you I will 6 times already," huffed Zorian. "What's so important about the dance? Anyway. What's going to happen there? Oh great traveler from the future. You have to see it to believe it," Zack sighed. "It's possibly even more implausible than time travel being real." "That bad?" asked Zorian. privately agreeing that an invasion of that scale was something he would have had trouble believing in if he had not lived through it. Just try to survive. Okay. Zack sighed. Before Zorian could say anything else, Zack suddenly donned a mask of fake cheerfulness and spoke in a voice loud enough to be heard by Ivory. Wow. Zorian. I'm sure glad we've had this talk, but I should really get going now. Have to be well rested for tomorrow. Bye. Zorian. Bye. Ivory. I'll see you both at the dance. And then he left. Zorian shook his head at the other boy's exit and walked up to Ivory, who was now free of purple rash that once covered her face and neck. Well, I guess we should go too, Zorian said. The academy normally doesn't have anyone patrolling after dark. But that idiot's shouting may have alerted someone to our presence. Oh. Right. Zorian watched Ivory as they filed out of the workshop, and he used his magic trick to relock the door again. She seemed strangely subdued for someone who got what they wanted. What's wrong? He finally asked after a while. Nothing's wrong, she said. Why do you ask? You don't seem very happy to be cured, he noted. I am, she protested. It's just. Yes, he prompted. I don't have anyone to go to the dance with, she said. The boy I was hoping to go with already has someone by now. If her unnamed boy was Fortov, probably. Considering her obvious crush on him. Then yes. He most certainly did. In fact, he probably had 1 week in advance. So there was never much chance of her going with him in the first place. But he didn't feel the need to crush her dreams like that. Then you'll just have to do the same thing I will and go to the dance all by yourself. Won't you? Concluded Zorian. She suddenly stopped and gave him an appraising glance. You don't have anyone to go with either? She asked. Zorian closed his eyes and swore in his head. He really walked into this one. Didn't he? Zorian was nervous. Ever since his very first restart. He had been studiously avoiding the city on the day of the festival. Not willing to get caught up in the invasion again. Being present within city limits could easily result in his grisly death. After all. And back then he wasn't sure whether his current restart would be his last. That wasn't an option anymore. Unless he wanted to clue in Zack that there was something wrong with him, he didn't. Bottom line was, he was stuck attending the dance. With the unexpected addition of Ivory as his date for the evening. He wasn't exactly happy with that. Actually, he didn't really have much of a plan for the evening. Except to wait and see what would happen. But Ivory's presence at his side would no doubt limit him. Not to mention that he still remembered his disastrous evening with Akoja. And had very little desire to live through a repeat performance. Consequences erasing time loop or not. Speaking of his evening with Akoja. Zorian had to admit one thing about Ivory, she was a lot more reasonable and considerate than Akoja was. She didn't drag him out of his room 2 hours before the event. Or make him wait smack in the middle of the huge throng of people gathered at the entrance. Or drag him off to chat with a bunch of people who only cared about him being Damon's and Fortov's brother. She was also more interested in scanning the crowd for any trace of Fortov than paying attention to him. But that was okay, he was under no illusion that she had asked him out because she was actually interested in him. After a while he decided to have mercy on her and informed her that Fortov was already inside. Preparing for tonight's performance along with the other members of the Academy Music Club. Naturally. Zack's entrance was in the boy's usual flamboyant style. He had caught everyone's attention when he had shown up with not one, but 2 dates for the evening. Zorian didn't recognize either girl. And then further would people by demonstrating some very impressive and attention-grabbing dancing. Apparently Zack had learned more than magic during these restarts. Zorian clapped with the others when Zack finally finished showing off. and considered the merits of sinking some time into a non-magical skill. Not dancing, though. Or any other, high society, skill. For that matter, honing those beyond the elementary level he had already grasped would require him to construct a mask so thorough he wasn't sure he'd be able to take it off afterwards. The benefits weren't worth selling his soul over. Even metaphorically. "This is a lot fancier than I thought it would be," Ivory noted, fingering the lacy tablecloth in front of her. "It's obviously more than just a school dance," agreed Zorian. "I'm guessing the Academy was organizing some kind of event for foreign dignitaries this year and then decided to simply merge it with the school dance for whatever reason." "I guess," Ivory said. "They did invest a lot into making everything look good this year. And I doubt they did it for our sake." Ivory looked at the far end of the table, where Zack was entertaining a small crowd around him. His 2 escorts nowhere to be seen. After a few seconds of this observation, she turned to Zorian and stared at him strangely. "What?" Zorian said, a little unnerved by her stare. "I've been meaning to ask you," she began hesitantly. "What is it between you and Zack? I mean, I know you're friends with him. But how did that come about? You seem very different from one another." "It's a recent thing," said Zorian. "And it was mostly Zack's doing. To be honest. All I did was escort him home after he got sick in class one day. And he decided we were best friends after that. I sort of went along with the flow." "So you don't know about, his sudden growth in skill?" guessed Zorian. He was actually surprised she hadn't questioned him about that sooner. Almost everyone else did. Of course. She would get the same shameless lie that he fed to everyone who questioned him about it. "I have no idea how that happened. But I can tell you it's real and not some kind of a trick like many people have been suggesting. He has been tutoring me in combat magic for a while now. And he really knows his stuff." "Yeah. I heard you were doing that," Ivory said, causing Zorian to frown. Being associated with Zack had made people disturbingly interested in his activities. No matter how mundane or irrelevant they may be. Having people scrutinize his every action like they had been doing for this past month was a novel experience. Novel and unwelcome. "Kieran has been kind of impressed with your growth. You know." "Yeah, at least until he found out that Zack was involved. At which point it simply became one more thing that made Zack such a mystery. Rather than a product of Zorian's own talent. Obviously Zack had some kind of secret teaching technique on top of everything else. Obviously. But it's not like he was still bitter or anything. Impressed." "Right," said Zorian sourly. "So what do you think is behind Zack's amazingness?" "Air. Well, it's kind of silly," Ivory said. Zorian gestured for her to go on. He always loved to hear the explanation people thought up to explain the mystery that was Zack. Much of the speculation wasn't serious. So much as attempts to think up the most imaginative, or the funniest, solution to the problem. So he doubted Ivory's explanation was any sillier than some of the stuff he had been hearing all month long. His personal favorite was that Zack performed an ancient ritual where you eat another person's brain in order to get their knowledge. "Time dilation," Ivory said after a brief moment of hesitation. Zorian blinked. "Oh, Ivory's so close. And yet so far away. I don't think any hasting spell is that effective." "To be honest," said Zorian. "Zack isn't just a little better than he was. I'd personally put him around third circle at least. I actually don't think he has any reason to attend the classes anymore. Except that he finds it amusing to do so and flaunt his knowledge to everybody." "I kind of noticed that," Ivory said, glancing momentarily to the small group of people surrounding Zack. "But I wasn't thinking of hasting magic. Do you know what the black rooms are?" Zorian shook his head in negative. "There are rumors that powerful nations like ours have special training facilities that use extreme levels of time dilation. You go inside the facility. Spend a couple of months. Or even years inside. And when you get out only a day or two have passed outside. Zorian's eyebrows rose at the description. If one of the major powers had something like that, why weren't the effects more keenly felt? None of the successor states were shy about using their power. And would have surely used such a tool to churn out trained mages on a mass scale by now. It's just a rumor, Ivory quickly added. Something between a conspiracy theory and an urban legend. I only know about it because one of my friends loves those kinds of things and she keeps insisting there is one such facility in the tunnels beneath the city. Supposedly they consume massive amounts of mana. So they must be located at mana wells. And the hole is the biggest mana well there is, Zorian noted. What's the explanation for such secrecy surrounding them? You'd think they'd be using it pretty intensively. They can't, Ivory said. Or at least that's how the story goes. They have some kind of severe limitations on their use. Exactly how countries pick who gets to use the black rooms is where the conspiracy theory part comes in. The more conventional theories suggest they're simply fancy facilities for training black ops super agents. The wilder ones are wild. It's a neat theory, Zorian hummed speculatively. Far closer to reality than anything else he'd heard. Though he'd never say that aloud. Even as a joke. If she could take such a far-fetched rumor seriously, there was a good chance she might actually believe him upon hearing the truth. And that would be very awkward at the moment. Maybe he should try to convince her in one of the next restarts. Something to think about. At least. But if Zack had spent years in one of those black rooms, why hasn't he visibly aged? And why exactly would they let Zack use one of those? Well, he didn't have to literally spend years, Ivory said. It's not that anything he's done is that advanced. A couple of months of intense tutoring could probably produce the effects we're looking at. And even if he spent years, there are potions that can halt your aging for a year or two. They actually work better on young people. Zorian resisted the urge to frown as he realized something. As much as Zack liked to show off, he never really went wild with his abilities for all to see. If Zack had showed the sort of magic he did during the invasion, neither Ivory nor anyone else would be dismissing Zack's prowess as not advanced so easily. Then again, perhaps that was the whole point. Extremely skilled Zack was surprising. Maybe even shocking to those who knew him before the change. Instant Archmage Zack would be probably alarming in the extreme and inspire a matching attitude in people around him. Perhaps Zack's behavior was a lot more calculated than he thought it was. As for why him? Ivory continued. Well, he's a Novita. They were quite influential before their eventual fall. And I don't just mean in the sense of being rich. They had their fingers everywhere. I could easily see some of that old influence surviving to this very day. Zack is the last of his line. And the fate of his house rests upon his shoulders. Perhaps this was simply a desperate maneuver by Zack's guardians. Trying to turn Zack into a worthy successor capable of returning Novita to their former glory. The ground shook. Followed by a deafening explosion less than a second later. Windows rattled. But didn't break. An uneasy silence descended upon the dance hall. Only broken by the periodic rumble of more distant explosions. What was that? Ivory asked fearfully. She wasn't the only one asking that kind of questions. Agitated murmurs started traveling through the gathered crowd. Steadily growing in volume and alarm. The ever-present pressure Zorian always felt from being inside crowds intensified and changed. What was usually just an annoyance pushing on the edges of his consciousness suddenly became a suffocating blanket of fear. He struggled not to faint as foreign feelings invaded his mind. What the hell was happening to him? He didn't remember anything about an attack like this from his previous experience of the invasion. A minute ticked away. Then 10. Zorian could practically feel the anxiety and agitation of the crowd steadily rising. The last, and first, time he had lived through the invasion, he was standing on the roof when that first barrage descended to Earth. And was momentarily incapacitated as a result. At least. That's what he had thought. Apparently he had been knocked out for quite a bit longer than he realized. Because by his reckoning Ilsa and Kiran should have been rushing to the roof to see what was happening by now. He could see them arguing about something in a nearby corner. And neither made the slightest move towards the roof. Zorian. Ibury tried for either the 5th or 6th time. Zorian wasn't sure. Are you sure you're alright? Maybe I should go find someone. I'm fine, Zorian said. Somehow managing to shove the oppressive feelings aside for the moment. The explosions had finally stopped, but that hadn't led to people calming down. If anything. Now that the situation had calmed down somewhat. They wanted answers. And they wanted them now. They were getting restless. Thankfully. The academy staff seemed to realize this as well. Look. Ilsa is trying to say something. Please remain calm. Ilsa said from the music stage. Using the same magic that carried music evenly across the dance hall to make herself heard by everyone present. Me and my colleague will go to the roof now and open communications with the city authorities to find out what is going on. Please don't go anywhere until we return. Well, that didn't do much to calm people down. If anything. They got even more unruly than they were before Ilsa's speech. And some outright ignored her warnings and left the dance hall the moment she went up the stairs and out of sight. He couldn't judge them too harshly. Since in another timeline he had done the exact same thing. On the positive side. The oppressive feeling lifted and reverted back to the familiar headache-inducing pressure. He breathed a giant sigh of relief. Hello. Zorian, greeted Zack. Approaching Zorian. Of course he'd come to talk to him now, quite a commotion. Huh. And I see you talked Miss Ambercombe into being your date for the evening. Congratulations. I never knew you liked older girls. I'm only a year older than him, Ibury protested. She glanced briefly at Zorian to see if he would point out that it was her who asked him out. And relaxed when she realized he wouldn't. Zorian had to restrain himself from rolling his eyes. And how come you're here all by yourself? Why don't you introduce us to your dates? If Ibury thought to fluster Zack by pointing out the plural nature of his partners for the evening, she was going to be sorely disappointed. And indeed, Zack only smiled at her. Completely unaffected by the jab. They decided to leave for home early, Zack shrugged. Probably for the best. Considering what happened. What did happen? Though? Asked Zorian. He didn't expect to get a straight answer out of Zack. Of course. But it was worth a try. I guess we'll find out soon, said Zack. Pointing to the bottom of the stairs leading to the roof. Where Ilsa was talking to a bunch of students. After a couple of seconds Zorian realized that Akoja was among them. And recognized several other faces as well. Who is she talking to? Asked Ibury. Class representatives. I think, Zorian said. At least. The ones I recognize are all class representatives for their groups. It was so frustratingly slow. Maybe Zorian was expecting a little too much from a mere educational institution. But their response to the invasion was pretty underwhelming. At the very least he had expected them to start evacuating people to the shelters by now. Or organize some kind of a defense force. Or well. Anything. Really. He was getting an impression that Ilsa and Kiran didn't even realize the severity of the situation yet. Finally. Ilsa seemed to finish with her instructions and the crowd of class representatives dispersed into the crowd. It only took Zorian a minute to realize what they were doing. Each one was gathering their own classmates into a single group. He bid Ivory goodbye and left towards his own group together with Zack. Once everyone was present, Akoja told them what the plan was. The Academy was going to use their limited teleportation capabilities to get foreign dignitaries and other important people out of the city. And the students were going to descend into the tunnels beneath the city to reach the shelters on foot, with no teachers present to guide and defend them. Because they had other duties currently and class representatives had to know the evacuation routes to get the job anyway. Zorian looked at Zack to gauge his reaction and saw that the boy's expression was grim and focused. "All right," Zack mumbled. "Show time." Zorian had a bad feeling about this. Surprisingly, it wasn't Zack who raised the alarm, it was Rainey. Of all people. How exactly she detected the winter wolves 5 minutes before they showed up he had no idea. But notice them she did, and she immediately raised the alarm. A lot of students didn't believe her. But most weren't willing to risk it. The entire procession of students started to move faster towards the small cylindrical building that marked the staircase leading down into the shelters. They never made it there before the winter wolves reached them. Zorian wasn't a soldier, and would never call himself an expert on tactics. But what the throng of students did upon sighting the horde of winter wolves coming after them still struck him as monumentally stupid. They scattered. The ones closest to the dungeon entrance rushed towards it. But the others immediately sought the closest shelter. He could hear Zack's frantic shouting, telling people not to separate from the main group, but it was in vain. Cursing, Zorian snatched Akoja by the wrist before she could bolt towards the nearby apartment building and wordlessly pointed towards the dungeon entrance. For a moment he thought about explaining his reasoning in more detail. But he knew he didn't have enough time for that. He let go of her and started running, hoping she would have the presence of mind to follow. Thankfully, she did follow him. As did several other students that witnessed the silent exchange and realized the importance of it. As they ran, more people joined them, seeking safety in numbers. Around him, chaos reigned. The winter wolves were pouring in by the hundreds. And unlike the fleeing students, they were frighteningly well coordinated. Small groups of 3 to 4 wolves detached themselves periodically from the main body to intercept lone targets before rejoining the horde, using their superior numbers to flank and outmaneuver their opponents. Their white fur and the surprising silence with which they moved made them seem like an army of ghosts risen from the underworld to punish the living. Screams, shouting, flashes of light and canine howls of pain too. Not every student was helpless. Up ahead Zack was defending the entrance to the tunnels viciously, sending swarm after swarm of force projectiles that hit far harder than your run-of-the-mill magic missile, felling scores of winter wolves with each volley. A number of people reached the safety of a nearby building and promptly barricaded themselves inside, ignoring the pleas of those outside to let them in. Just as Zorian thought they would make it to the entrance without incident, his luck ran out. A large group of 30 or so winter wolves noticed them and moved to intercept. The group halted immediately, unsure what to do as the pack continued to get closer. They had to go through it to reach the shelters. But fighting the wolves was suicide. Zack was busy incinerating a group of war trolls that finally made their appearance and wouldn't be able to help for a while. "I told you I should have brought my sword," one of the boys groused. "But no. It's not suitable for a school dance, you said. You're too paranoid for your own good. You said." "Oh, shut up," a female voice snapped back. Zorian resisted the urge to fire off a couple of missiles at the approaching winter wolves. Even shaped as piercers, they weren't guaranteed to kill in one shot something as resilient as a winter wolf. And he still tended to fail quite often when he tried to weave a homing function in them. So there was no guarantee he would even hit anything. He had to use his mana intelligently. Not everyone thought so. However, a number of people had a spell formula hidden on them in the form of a ring or a necklace. Much like he did. And they threw missile after magic missile into the advancing wolves. Only one girl was capable of casting a proper homing bolt. So most of them missed. And when they did hit, they were just smashers, so they didn't kill any of them. They did, however, slow the pack down and force it to cluster together. Since the girl that could fire homing bolts targeted any wolf that tried to detach from the pack to flank them. And that gave him an idea. The moment the pack got close enough, Zorian fired an overpowered flamethrower straight into their front lines. Clustered together as they were, most of them were caught in the blast. The winter wolves, notoriously weak to fire, howled in fear and agony. That's when someone else fired another flamethrower into their ranks. This one much bigger and hotter than Zorian's. And the winter wolves promptly turned and fled. The ones that still lived. That is. Zorian turned to see who cast the other flamethrower and was surprised to see Brian there, staring smugly at the charred corpses in front of him. He was holding his fire drake in his arms like a living weapon. And the little lizard was licking its chops like it wanted to eat its kills. So much for his theory that the drake was too young to breathe fire. After a moment of shock at the sudden reversal, they all scrambled into the building housing the dungeon entrance and immediately descended into the tunnels below. Zorian was immediately intercepted by a worried Ivory, who seemed extremely relieved that he was alive. Even though he knew her death wouldn't be permanent. He had to admit he was glad she survived as well. Though, now that he could sit down and think about it a little, it wasn't that unusual she had survived. She was a fourth-year student. And they were at the front of the procession for some reason. That was very unfortunate. Because fourth-year students were, presumably, much more capable of defending themselves than third-year ones, and they were the ones who reached the safety of the shelters first, leaving their younger compatriots to fend for themselves. "I didn't know you had any fire spells," Brian noted from his left, stroking his familiar affectionately. "I guess that's one of the things Zack has been teaching you this past month." "Huh. Yeah," Zorian admitted. He gave the fire lizard a dubious look. And the reptile stared back at him challengingly. "Did you really bring your familiar to the school dance?" "Oh. No way," Brian laughed. "I'm not that attached to him. No. I used a recall spell to summon him to my side when the winter wolves started pouring in. Isn't summoning pretty mana intensive? Though?" Zorian asked. "Not if you're summoning your familiar," Brian said. "We're bound together. He and I. Connected through the soul. It's a lot easier and a lot less taxing to cast certain spells where they concern him." "Huh," Zorian hummed. An hour went by, with little to show for it. Zorian listened to stories of people around him, trying to put some sense into what had transpired and thinking what he could change in the next restart to make this evacuation thing less of a fiasco. His thoughts were interrupted when a group of teachers finally stumbled into the shelters. There were 6 of them and they looked tired and frightened. Much like the students who had gathered around them for explanations and assurances. The only one among them that inspired confidence in Zorian was Kiran, who remained as stoic as always. He was no longer bare-chested, opting to wear full-body armor that sort of resembled the chitinous shell of a saint bug, and had a plethora of spell rods hanging off his belt in addition to the combat staff he was firmly gripping in one hand. Kiran had bad news: the attack on the academy was just one piece in an all-out invasion targeting the entire city. Zorian already knew this, of course. But everyone else was suitably shocked. The invasion was well prepared. And most of the defenders had been overpowered right at the start. The city was about to fall. Once that happened, the shelters would become just a giant death trap. They would have to go outside and fight their way out of the city before the invaders could secure everything of critical importance and turn their attention to them. People were taking it pretty badly. "Why don't you just teleport us out?" someone called. "You're supposed to be able to do that." "Academy ward control has been subverted," Kiran said calmly. "The invaders have turned our own teleportation wards against us. We can't teleport in or out." Zorian groaned. The enemy had control of the wards. How on earth did they do that? The academy wasn't just some random house with a generic warding scheme. It's supposed to be too secure and sophisticated for that. The questions continued for a minute or so before Kiran got enough of it and started to bark out orders. They needed to get moving. Zorian was paying attention to something else though. The student next to him had been acting strangely ever since Kiran and his cohort entered the shelters. Zorian could practically feel the boy's eagerness and anticipation. For what? He couldn't say. But he had a feeling it was nothing good. That is why. When the boy threw a vial full of sickly green liquid on the floor and smashed it with his foot, Zorian held his breath and fired a smasher straight into the boy's chest. Foul-smelling green smoke erupted from the broken vial. And the shelters erupted into chaos. Zorian couldn't see anything through the no doubt poisonous smoke. But the sounds of fighting were unmistakable. He stumbled through the smoke, trying to find an end to it and failing. He could tell from the hacking students around him that breathing in would be a bad idea. Thank God it didn't also irritate the eyes, or he'd never be able to cast a shield in time to stop a magic missile from smashing into his face. A circular plane of force flickered into existence in front of him, soaking the hit. The shield wavered for a second but held. And then Zorian heard Kiran shout a series of words. And all the smoke around him rushed towards the source of Kiran's voice. As if caught in some sort of vacuum. Zorian had just enough time to see Kiran holding his left hand in the air, a smoky green ball compacting itself above it, before he was forced to erect a shield again. At least he could breathe now. Thank the gods for small favors. Before the attackers who had probably teleported in under the cover of smoke. Because Zorian would remember a bunch of middle-aged men in brown robes if they had been present when he got into the shelters could regain initiative. Kiran snapped one of his hands and a shining whip flashed through the air. The invaders promptly fell apart, the upper half of their bodies sliding off the lower half like they were never attached to one another at all. Zorian stared at Kiran in shock. He knew the retired battle mage was capable. But seeing it was something else. The man had assessed the situation within moments and solved it with a total of 2 spells. He wondered what would have happened during the initial evacuation if Kiran had been leading the students. He couldn't help but think that Kiran would have found a way to repel the initial winter wolf rush without losing anyone. Certainly the students would be more inclined to listen to Kiran than their class representatives. The man had a certain aura of command around him. "How the hell are you still standing?" wheezed Zack not far from him. Apparently he had breathed in some of the smoke. And was affected just like everyone else. Even decades-old time travelers could be brought down by some tricks. It seemed. Zorian was about to answer when the ground exploded next to him, showering him with stone fragments and knocking him on his back. He heard Kiran chanting something. But it was too late for him. The giant brown worm that emerged from the ground was far faster than it should have been, and Zorian was in too much pain to move. He saw a huge toothy maw closing around him. And then he knew only blackness. His last thoughts were that it wasn't fair. Just how many contingencies did these people have? These invaders were freaking cheaters. Zorian's eyes abruptly shot open as sharp pain erupted from his stomach. His whole body convulsed, buckling against the object that fell on him. And suddenly he was wide awake. Not a trace of drowsiness in his mind. Good dash. No. It's not, Zorian interrupted. How could it possibly be a good morning? I got killed again. Eaten by a giant worm this time. And waking up like this is really starting to get on my nerves. Couldn't the time loop have started a day later or something? He stared at his little sister expectantly. She stared back at him. Confused out of her mind and probably a little frightened. What? She asked hesitantly. Zorian wordlessly flipped her over the edge of the bed. She fell to the floor with a thud and an indignant yelp. And Zorian quickly jumped to his feet to better respond to any violence she might decide to retaliate with. Having learned his lesson during previous restarts, he immediately set out towards the bathroom before she could get her bearings. She realized what he was doing quickly. But by then he had already locked the door behind him. Her screams of outrage were music for his ears. Especially since they eventually caused Mother to come after her and give her a scolding. Maybe it was a good morning. After all, trained Zorian hadn't really liked them to start with. But he was starting to develop an intense dislike of them ever since he was caught in this time loop thing. Traveling via train on a regular basis was almost as annoying as Kiriel jumping on him at the start of every restart. He had toyed with the idea of killing time by striking a conversation with Ivory. So she'd be familiar with him when he got a job at the library. But scrapped the notion after a while. Mostly because he decided not to apply for the job in this restart. Working at the library like he had been doing was fairly time-consuming. And he had a much more promising project to work on mastering all the shaping exercises in Ilsa's book so he could woo her into taking him as her apprentice. Library magic was useful. But getting rid of Svim would be absolutely priceless. He wouldn't be present in Scioria when the invasion came either. Not in this restart. Nor in any near future one. Even if he had to reveal his secret to Zack because of it. He'd take the first train out of town on the eve of the summer festival. He knew that the smart, responsible thing to do would be to stay in the city and note what was happening, how the invasion was progressing and what could be done to stop it. He knew it. But it was too much for him. And not just because getting himself involved in that mess seemed to invariably lead to his death. Either. The emotional roller coaster of the evacuation was very hard on his nerves. But that was just a symptom of the real problem. He struggled with his thoughts for a moment, trying to identify the root of the problem. Every reason he could think of felt not right. And then it clicked. It was the helplessness. Every time his thoughts strayed towards the topic of the invasion, he couldn't shake the notion that the forces arrayed against him were vastly beyond his ability to handle. And that the only reason he survived as long as he had was through sheer dumb luck. It occurred to him that the manner of his most recent death could easily be an allegory for this entire invasion. So you repelled a murderous pack of winter wolves and reached safety. Helped foil a traitorous ambush. And now you think the worst is over. No. Stupid. A giant worm suddenly jumps out of the ground and bites your head off. How were you supposed to fight something like that? How was he supposed to fight something like that? Maybe he shouldn't. A lot of things about the invasion seemed implausible. About as implausible as Zack becoming a super prodigy over the span of a single summer. Zorian learning all 15 shaping exercises in Ilsa's book within the span of a month. Or time travel being real. What if his theory of there being a third time traveler was correct? And that someone was the mastermind behind the invasion? It would explain a lot. Then again, it would also pose a lot of questions on its own, like why hadn't this hostile time traveler dealt with Zack already? The Lich had already proved it was very much possible to hurt people like Zack and Zorian. And was working for the invading forces already. Regardless, he intended to involve himself again with the invasion only after he acquired some serious magic. Or after he calmed down somewhat and felt emotionally capable of facing the situation. Whichever came first. It's not like he could study the invasion in any great detail if he kept dying at the very start of it. Anyway. Eventually the train arrived in Scioria. And Zorian began his long trek towards the academy. He wasn't in a hurry this time. Because he had finally found a spell to protect himself from rain in the last restart and was eager to try it. Well, he had actually found several protective spells meant to deal with rain and other adverse weather. But only one was within his ability to actually cast. That was okay. Though, since the rain barrier spell was the one best suited for his purposes anyway, it offered the most complete protection. At the cost of being horribly draining to maintain. He could see why the mana drain would be a serious problem for people who wanted to use the spell extensively. But Zorian only needed it to last for an hour or two in an exceptionally mana-rich area of Scioria. Also, being encased in an invisible sphere that repelled water was just plain more impressive than the more subtle, sophisticated wards. The barrier actually worked on water in general. Not just raindrops. So he didn't even have to worry about stepping into puddles and soaking his footwear. Seeing water on the road part before him like in front of some kind of celestial emissary was mightily amusing. Also a bit of an ego boost. Which is something he sorely needed after being so thoroughly outmatched during the invasion of the previous restart. He'd probably never use the spell after getting out of the time loop. Since an umbrella was good enough for most occasions and didn't consume any mana. But finding a store that sold them along his usual route from the train station had proved surprisingly difficult. Which, now that he thought about it, suggested that he probably would use the spell from time to time. Since he doubted this would be the only time in his life he'd find himself without an easily acquired umbrella. He shook his head. He really shouldn't be fantasizing about what he'd do after getting out of the time loop. Since it didn't appear that would happen any time soon. He had to concentrate on the present, and boy did that sound weird. Considering his situation. Like, what was he going to do with Zack? He was sorely tempted to just admit everything to the boy and have them try to figure out this mess together. Surely two heads are better than one. Impulsive he may be. But Zack couldn't have gotten as far as he did without having a good head on his shoulders. He didn't feel entirely comfortable with that idea. Though he strongly suspected there was more to Zack than it appeared. And he hated to charge in without knowing what he was getting himself into. He decided to see how Zack interacted with him in this restart before deciding. Zorian. Over here. Zorian glanced towards the happy-looking Benesek waving at him like a lunatic and wondered what he should do. He didn't really want to talk to him. Benesek might be his closest friend among the student body. But he was also rather irritating at times. And it's not like he could tell Zorian something he didn't already know at this point. In the end he sighed in defeat and trudged over to the grinning boy. Time loop or no. It felt wrong to blatantly snub someone so visibly happy to see him. Especially since he shared so much history with Benesek. He did find it interesting that Benesek was present in the cafeteria at this time. Since that wasn't his usual behavior in the restarts Zorian experienced so far. These kind of unexplained divergences happened all the time. Which was to be expected. There were at least 2 time travelers wandering around the time loop. Changing things both inconsequential and crucial, but it was surprising to see a change this soon into the time loop. It had only been a day since he arrived in Scioria. Usually it took at least a week until everything went off the rails. And even then a lot of things repeated themselves. Most teachers followed some kind of a fixed teaching plan. For example. And rarely deviated from it. As far as he knew. Fortov always came looking for him for help with the purple creeper salve. Even though his accident with Ivory only happened near the very end of the time loop. Which, now that he thought about it, suggested the accident wasn't so accidental after all. Kind of suspicious for an accident to be so insensitive to changes. You just got to Scioria. Didn't you? Benesek prompted excitedly the moment Zorian sat down beside him. Zorian nodded hesitantly. Benasek was only ever this excited when talking about a particularly hot girl or when he got a hold of particularly juicy gossip material. Hopefully it was the latter. Because there was no way Zorian would be staying otherwise. "You're so not going to believe this," Benasek said excitedly. "You know Zach. You know. Zach Novita. Last scion of the noble house Novita. He went to class with us these last 2 years. Of course it's Zach. He really should have known." "Of course I know him," Zorian said. "He is very memorable." "He is," blinked Benasek. He shook his head. "I mean. Of course he is. I kind of didn't expect you to know. Though. Since he's kind of a failure as a mage and you never interacted with him much." Zorian shrugged. Truth be told, it was very rare for him to forget someone's name. Regardless of how often he had interacted with them or how long it had been since he last saw them. Even before the time loop, Zorian would have instantly known who Benasek was referring to. Anyway, Benasek continued. "Zach escaped from his family mansion yesterday." "What?" asked Zorian incredulously. "What do you mean, escaped? Why would he need to escape from his own mansion?" "Well, that's the question. Isn't it?" Benasek said. Apparently he had an argument with his guardian that eventually descended into a full-blown magical duel. A duel which. Get this. Zach won. Half of the mansion was trashed. And Zach fled into the city and has yet to be found. They're searching for him everywhere. Wow, Zorian said. Honestly at a loss for words. What the hell was that about? You said it, Benasek agreed. I'm not sure I believe the official story. Though. I mean. There's no way Zach could have taken on his guardian in a magical duel. Tezen Zveri is a 7th circle mage or something. And Zach barely passed his own certification. Then again. Something sure demolished Novita Mansion. How do you know this? Asked Zorian. It's all over the newspapers, said Benasek. Besides. Everyone is talking about it. I can't believe one of our classmates would be involved in something like that. What do you think? Zorian. Ben, I honestly don't know what to think about that, said Zorian. And he really meant it. He didn't doubt for a second that Zach could beat the stuffing out of his guardian. 7th circle or not, the man was a politician. As far as Zorian knew. Not a battlemage, but why would he want to do that? I suppose he won't be coming to class this time. Then, mused Zorian out loud. Then again. He would not have put it past Zach to just walk into class one of these days as if nothing was wrong. I doubt it, Benasek laughed. Did he kill anyone? Asked Zorian. Benasek shook his head in the negative. So basically he didn't do anything that's serious. What's the worst that can happen to him if he simply turns himself in? Well. Tezen must not be too happy with him now. And he's too influential to brush off. Even for someone like Zach, said Benasek. Attacking one of the elders of Eldamar is actually a fairly serious crime. And Tezen could really ruin Zach's day if he was inclined to pursue satisfaction. Not that I think he would. Since that would just draw even more attention to what happened. This whole thing is a giant political scandal for him. I'm guessing Zach will come back after a month or so. After he cools off a bit. And Tezen will magnanimously forgive him everything. Zorian was silent. Zach had told him that it was rare for him to spend a restart in Scioria. And even rarer for him to attend classes. In light of that, it had been foolish of him to expect Zach to be around in this restart. Zach may have found Zorian interesting in the previous restart. But probably not that interesting. Still. This was more than a little strange. If he had wanted to leave and do his own thing. Couldn't he have just walked out of his mansion one day and kept going? Who would have stopped him? His guardian? Why would Tezen do that? The man was clearly very hands-off in his dealings with his charge. As evidenced by Zach's frequent absences from school during the last 2 years. As well as Zach's abysmal performance prior to the time loop. There was no obvious answer. And Zorian didn't feel like trying to track down Zach. He probably couldn't find him. Even if he tried. And he had more attainable goals to pursue. Like getting out of Svim's merciless clutches. What could be more important than that? The rest of the restart was pleasantly uneventful. There was no Zach. Since the boy never showed up in school and couldn't be found by anyone. After a week or so, the newspapers stopped covering the story because there were no new developments to justify the articles. And the rumors making rounds across the student body died down soon after. For his part, Zorian threw himself completely into mastering the exercises in Ilsa's book. He neglected virtually everything else. Often skipping classes when he thought he could get away with it. Akoja was furious. Since he was apparently ruining the attendance record of the class. And got Ilsa to corner him one day about it. Fortunately, Zorian's ability to get top grades on every exam, despite his spotty attendance, blunted the impact of Akoja's criticism. And Zorian managed to convince Ilsa he was working on a personal project that was taking most of his time, not skipping classes for the heck of it as Akoja claimed. He assured her the project would be finished within a month. And that he would resume attending classes regularly after the summer festival. She made him promise that he would show her what he was working on when he was done. And he enthusiastically agreed with her. His single-minded focus gave results quickly. He mastered both vertical and fixed position levitation by the end of the restart. He didn't bother showing these advanced skills to Svim, who was still having him work on the pen-spinning exercise. Since he doubted he'd get a worthwhile reaction. Nothing seemed to please that guy. He hadn't been present in the city when the invasion came. Of course. Without Zach's ring. He was even more useless in combat than he was in the last restart. So it was doubtful he could have lasted for very long in the midst of it all. He did make sure to practice with combat invocations he learned from Zach each day. Hoping to hone them into the same reflexive state that Zach displayed. That would take years of practice. Of course. But that just meant he'd better start as soon as possible. He also didn't just leave via train like he usually did. He traveled by foot to one of the hills overlooking the city and observed the city from there. Watching the invasion unfold from such a high vantage point was not only a lot easier on Zorian's nerves than being in the thick of it, it was also rather informative. It was interesting to see how the invasion played out in broad terms. It seemed to have several stages. The first of which was, of course, the disguised artillery magic barrage. The explosive flares mostly targeted 3 crucial areas: the city hall, the local military base, and one cluster of buildings that Zorian didn't recognize. The academy didn't appear to be a primary target. Possibly because the invaders wanted it reasonably intact. Aside from the initial blast, the impact zone seemed to spawn scores of fire elementals that had to be dealt with. Fortunately, a lot of buildings in Scioria were at least moderately warded against fire. Because Zorian didn't doubt for a second that the entire city would have been aflame within minutes otherwise. Once the fire elementals had a few minutes to make a nuisance of themselves, monsters poured out of the sewers. And after they rampaged across the city a bit, the spellcasters finally arrived. The battle was still raging when the clock finally hit 2 past midnight and everything went suddenly black. All things considered, the army of monsters was the least destructive part of the invasion if he could somehow prevent the initial barrage from crippling the city defense right from the start. Or take out a lot of the attacking mages that followed in the monsters' wake. Well, it was worth a shot when he finally got some skills under his belt. The next 3 restarts were essentially the same. Right down to Zack dueling his guardian and escaping into the night. Apparently that wasn't just a one-time thing, but a rather routine occurrence. The exact details varied, but every time he roughed Tezzin up before setting off God knows where. Unfortunately, Zorian couldn't find out anything substantial about Tezzin. The man was a high-ranking politician, and thus not exactly approachable. And nothing in publicly available sources explained Zack's apparent hostility towards the man. His work with Ilsa's book progressed steadily, but he was frankly getting a bit sick of it. There was only so much of incessant shaping practice he could stand before he lost all enthusiasm. Besides, Ilsa said most students go through them at a rate of 6 per year. And he was already more effective than that, something that he attributed to his unusual focus in the matter. How many people could afford to focus all their energies on shaping exercises? There were so many things vying for the typical student's attention that shaping exercises no doubt ended up near the bottom of their priorities. That was why he was currently in Ilsa's office, trying to see if he could get something out of her without mastering quite the entire book. "What can I do for you, Mr. Kaczynski?" Ilsa asked. "Well, I'm a bit concerned about the program you outlined in your first class," said Zorian. "I'm not sure I'll get anything out of it, since I already have a solid grasp on all the topics you mentioned." Ilsa raised an eyebrow at him. "Hey! It worked on Kirin. Why wouldn't it work on Ilsa too?" "I see," she said after a second of silence. "Would you mind if I gave you a couple of quick tests to confirm that?" Confident he could deal with anything she tested him with, he agreed. Ilsa proceeded to rummage through her drawers and took out 2 different tests. One was an exact copy of the same test Ilsa gave to the whole class just before the summer festival. And Zorian proceeded to fill it out in 10 minutes flat by sheer memory. The other was unfairly hard, because it covered advanced topics that didn't turn up in class at all. Zorian only managed to fill out a quarter of the questions before time was up. And he was fairly sure not all of his answers were correct. Ilsa skimmed through them quickly and then nodded to herself. "Your theoretical knowledge is pretty spotty," Ilsa said with a theatrical sigh. And Zorian had to stop himself from scowling. That was such bullshit. She gave him that second test just to make sure he failed. "Here, I'll give you a list of additional reading to study in your free time." 2 minutes later Zorian found himself practically pushed out of the door, a piece of paper with hastily scribbled writing in his hand. He glared at the list of book titles, very much tempted to incinerate it on the spot. He was supposed to start on the variations of the flame-producing exercise anyway. But he didn't. He would not be defeated that easily. If he could survive Svim's mentoring methods this long, he could definitely read a couple of theoretical manuals. He would be back. She could be sure of that. "Good morning, brother." "Morning. Morning. Morning. Good morning, Kiri," said Zorian pleasantly. "Thank you for waking me up." Kiriel stared at him for a couple of seconds and then huffed in disappointment at his lack of reaction and got off of him all on her own. "Well, damn, he should have tried that ages ago." "You're no fun," she accused. Zorian simply nodded in agreement. "Mom wants to talk to you," Kiriel said. "Could you show me some magic before you go, though? Please?" "Well, why not?" He quickly cast the floating lantern spell, causing an orb of light to spring into existence above his palm. He had the orb fly around the room while he repeated the spell 2 more times, producing a different colored orb each time. The books Ilsa had told him to read were mostly boring crap, but they did tell him something rather interesting. All those variations he had been practicing had more uses than just improving his shaping skills. Apparently they also allowed him to adjust certain spells more to his liking. The same variation of the light-emitting exercise that allowed him to produce colored light also enabled him to change the color of the glowing orb produced by the floating lantern spell. Mastering a whole bunch of light-related exercises would apparently also make light-based invocations more powerful and less mana-intensive. And the same principle applied to other groups of spells as well, such as fire-related exercises improving invocations based around fire and heat. And levitation-based ones improving spells relying on telekinetic forces. He was a lot less annoyed at having to go through all those shaping exercises when he found that out. Hell! If they were that useful. He'd probably see if he could find more of them when he ran out of the ones in Ilsa's book. More! More! Kiri demanded. Distracting Kiri with a few more orbs. Zorian quietly slipped out of the room and went to the bathroom before Kiri could realize what was happening. Why was she always so intent on getting there first anyway? That was horribly petty. Even for Kiriel. He'd have to ask her in one of the restarts. Unfortunately, he sort of forgot he filled his entire room with multicolored orbs of light by the time Ilsa came around to visit. So he thought nothing about inviting her into his room. He hastily swept his hand in front of him, casing them all to wink out of existence. But it was too late. Isla had already seen them and was looking at him curiously. That's not really a second-year spell, Ilsa remarked, her eyes boring into his own. Daimen can be a pretty good teacher when he wants to be, said Zorian with a cheeky smile, shamelessly relying on Damon's fame to deflect any concerns. Teaching first circle spells like that one to uncertified mages was illegal. But if Zorian ever learned something in his life, it was that Daimen can get away with anything. And you know how to produce something other than white light, Ilsa noted. Impressive. I guess this should be easy for you. Then. She handed him a very familiar scroll. And Zorian was just about to flood it with mana to break the seal when he realized something was wrong. Ilsa was studying him like a hawk. Expectant and alert. She had never shown this much interest in his scroll opening before. So what made this one special? He stared at the scroll for a couple of seconds, unable to see any difference from the scroll he was used to. Even the symbols on the seal were the same. Wait. A few moments later he remembered where he saw the symbols inscribed on the seal and promptly felt like banging his head against the wall or something. Why those sneaky little. He had been doing it wrong. All this time he had been simply pouring mana into the seal to break it. When instead he had to channel mana into it in very specific ways so he could peel it off intact. It said so. Right at the goddamn seal. It required more mana control than simply flooding the seal with mana. But it was nothing he hadn't already been capable of. Even before the time loop. All this time he had thought the symbols on the seal were purely ornamental in nature. But no. They were instructions. Instructions written in a somewhat obscure form. But still. How could he have missed that? He directed his mana to flow along the sides of the seal, causing it to pop off without resistance. Well done, Ilsa said with a smile. Not many students have such a firm grasp on their magic at this stage. I see someone is continuing in Damon's footsteps. Zorian smiled back politely. He mustn't scowl. He mustn't scowl. Unfortunately. I'm in a bit of a hurry, so we'll have to continue this conversation later, Ilsa said. Visit me in my office when you get to Scioria. Now about your electives. Ilsa stared at him. He stared back. She glanced towards the two completely filled-out tests on her desk and then returned her gaze towards him. This time with a speculative look. Zorian remained silent. It actually felt good to baffle someone like this. Zorian decided. Apparently Ilsa wasn't as cold-blooded about improbable skills as Svim was. I must admit. I didn't quite expect this level of knowledge and shaping skill when I told you to come and see me, Ilse said thoughtfully. That second exam I gave you is the one I give to students at the end of their third year. And you only got 2 of the questions wrong. On top of that, you know 10 different variations of the basic 3. Which is astronomical for a third-year student. She tapped her pen against the table. Lost in thought. You may be a bit too advanced for what I intend to teach your group this year, Ilse finally admitted. My class is mostly there to make sure the students don't have any obvious holes in their shaping skills and theoretical knowledge. And to teach them a few miscellaneous spells that are of general utility to most mages. You're way beyond that. What am I going to do with you? Transfer me away from Swim so you could teach such a promising student? Zorian tried. She laughed at him. Sorry, she said. You're good. But not that good. Besides, you should have it easier than most of Swim's 6 air charges. What with your amazing shaping skills and all. You'd be surprised how little difference that makes to him, Zorian sighed. Oh come on. Mr. Kaczynski. You didn't even have a single session with him, Ilse chided. I'm sure that whatever rumors you heard were greatly exaggerated. Right, said Zorian. Unable to keep himself from rolling his eyes. Can you at least give me a written permit to skip your lectures? You said yourself I have nothing to learn there. Anyway. That wasn't quite what Zorian was after. But he supposed it was better than nothing. It would give him a bunch of free periods throughout the week. Which wasn't terribly useful while he was inside the time loop, where he could just skip classes if he needed more free time, but would come in handy when and if he got out of it. And besides, a written permit would cut down on Akoja's whining. If nothing else. No, Ilse said. I need you in class. If only to motivate the rest of your classmates to try harder. Don't worry. I'll make sure you're not bored during class. Crap. Maybe he shouldn't have asked her that. In the meantime, I'm going to do you a favor, Ilse continued. While I am personally too busy to teach you, I will see if I can find a teacher willing to give you some private instruction. Do you have an area of magic you're particularly interested in? Personally, I would recommend you look into either divination or alteration. But it's your choice. Spell formulas, Zorian said firmly. Oh. Ambitious, noted Ilse. It's a hard subject. Not something your shaping skills can help you with. Either. I'm certain, Zorian confirmed. Spell formulas had fascinated him ever since he started to learn magic. So there was no way he was wasting this kind of opportunity. Very well, Ilse shrugged. I don't foresee any problems. In that case, I'm sure Miss Boole will be ecstatic to have such a talented and determined student. Miss Boole. As in Nora Boole. The orange-haired maniac that expected them to read 12 books within a week and gave them 60-question progress tests every other lecture. Zorian resisted the urge to sigh. Why couldn't he have a normal mentor for once? Why is your test longer than mine? Benesek whispered to him hurriedly. Did I lose a page or something? You didn't, Zorian whispered back. Nora is just testing me because, well, it doesn't matter. I'll tell you later. Zorian sighed and continued pondering the advanced spell formula questions in front of him. As if the original 60-question test hadn't been enough. Worse. Nora took a page out of Ilse's book and decided to test him on knowledge that he technically shouldn't even have. Because the additional questions had nothing to do with second-year curriculum. Thankfully, he had actually read all 12 of her recommended books over the course of several previous restarts. So he wasn't completely stumped while looking at the piece of paper in front of him. Still, the additional questions were encouraging. Since they suggested Nora was taking him a lot more seriously than she usually did when he asked for some advanced instructions out of her. In the handful of restarts he had tried, The results were underwhelming while enthusiastic about her subject. Nora Boole never seemed to believe he was as advanced as he claimed. All of his teachers were like that. As far as he could tell from his initial attempts. With Kieran being the biggest exception. Though now that he thought about it, that probably had more to do with the ease with which his proficiency with the magic missile spell could be demonstrated, rather than Kieran's inclination to believe his claims. In any case, the sheer speed with which things were happening gave him hope. It was only yesterday that he and Ilsa had talked in her office. And already Nora was testing him. That was absurdly fast. Since teachers like to take their time about things like this, Zorian had expected the entire process to take a week. At least. Apparently he had left an even bigger impression on Ilsa than he thought he had. Good. It was nice to have a confirmation that he was actually going somewhere, rather than just wasting his time. A few minutes later his peace was once again broken by Benesek. He gritted his teeth as the boy started to pester him for answers. Zorian had always found Benesek to be somewhat annoying. Despite him being Zorian's best friend, or at least the closest thing to it. But Zorian found himself steadily losing his patience with the boy as restart after restart went by. It wasn't really fair to Benesek. The chubby boy was behaving no worse than his usual fare, but the time loop made Benesek's antics annoyingly repetitive. He quickly scribbled answers to a handful of questions on a piece of paper and thrust it at Benesek. Benesek looked like he would say something to him in his not whisper. Benesek whispered far too loudly for it to be called a real whisper. But Zorian silenced him with a quick glare. As annoying as Benesek might be, Zorian wasn't ready to give up on him just yet. Whether that resolve would hold throughout the entire time loop remained to be seen. However. All right. Time's up. Pencils down. Everyone, Nora said, earning her a wave of protests from the student body. Except for Mr. Kaczynski. That is. He can keep working on that special second test I gave him. Zorian cursed internally as all eyes momentarily shifted towards him. She just had to tell that in front of the whole class. Didn't she? He made a note to himself to watch what he said in front of Nora. Since discretion obviously wasn't her strong suit. Akoja hurriedly collected all the tests. Lingering slightly longer near his desk so she could see what his special test was all about. After that, the class continued as normal. It was the exact same thing he had already listened to countless times before in the previous restarts. So he did his best to block it out and continue solving the test. Even with his massively unfair advantage. The test was rather hard. Spell formula in general involved a lot of mathematics and geometry. As the very name of the discipline hinted at. And that automatically made it hard for a lot of people, him included. Eventually the class came to an end. And Nora asked him to stay behind while everyone else filed out of the classroom. She immediately started to look over his tests when the last of his classmates left. And Zorian watched her intently for a reaction. Unlike Svim. Or even Ilsa. Nora Boole was a very expressive woman. By the time she had reached the end of the first test, he could see she was pleasantly surprised. She damn well should be. Considering it was 100% correct. When she started inspecting the second test, though, her face quickly morphed first into shock. And then barely restrained glee. Evidently she liked what she saw. Finally, she set the test aside and met his eyes. Giving him a penetrating gaze that actually caused Zorian to flinch a little. She reminded him of Zack and Kirathishli. Because she seemed to radiate a similar sort of vibrancy. For the lack of a better word. It was always a bit uncomfortable being around people like that. Especially when they were focused solely on him like Nora currently was. Well, she began. I didn't expect that. Do you know why I gave you the second test? No, said Zorian. To scare me off. Exactly. Nora exclaimed. Exactly. Zorian blinked. Unable to believe she actually admitted that to his face. Spell formulas require bravery. They require passion, continued Nora animatedly. Funny. Everyone else said they required patience and meticulousness. They require determination. Anyone who is scared off by this little thing here, she waved the second test in front of his face, will surely give up when we delve into the truly difficult parts of the discipline. I had to make sure you wouldn't bail out on me somewhere along the line. Zorian was starting to feel a little unnerved by Nora's outburst. Was he signing up for spell formula tutoring or cult membership? Of course. I didn't actually expect you to solve any of the questions correctly, Nora said. I just wanted to see if you'd leave it completely blank. Not that I'm complaining. Far from it. Let's see. She went back to her desk and pulled out a stack of papers out of a drawer. She frowned as she leafed through them, apparently unhappy about their contents, before finally setting them aside with a sigh. After an entire minute of silence, she glanced towards him and shook her head, as if suddenly remembering he was still there. Tell me. What are spell formulas? She asked him. And I don't want to hear a textbook definition. I want to hear it in your words. Zorian opened his mouth for a moment and then quickly snapped it shut as he considered what to say. Come on, Nora encouraged. Bravery. Remember? Besides, I just want to know your opinion. There is no right answer. Ha. There might be no right answer. But Zorian knew from experience that there was always a wrong answer. Always. But he supposed that, in this particular instance, silence was the wrongest answer of them all. It's the practice of using geometric shapes and various sigils to modify spells. Usually in order to strengthen wards or amplify spellcasting, said Zorian. Really? How do they do that? Asked Nora in mock curiosity. They limit mana flow along predetermined pathways, tried Zorian. Yes, agreed Nora. They limit. That's exactly what they do. I can't tell you how many mages think they're some kind of inherent amplifier or something. Drives me crazy. I tell you. Of course. Most modern crafters use special materials that are inherent amplifiers. But that's something else entirely. Anyway. You know the point behind structured spellcasting. Right? The narrower the effect of the spell is, the more mana efficient it becomes. Structured magic creates a spell boundary to forcibly narrow down effect space into something manageable for a human spellcaster. And spell formulas are the exact same thing. Only with more pronounced benefits and drawbacks, said Nora. Since mages can take their time when crafting the spell formula, they limit the mana flow much more tightly than your typical invocation. This means bigger potential benefits, but also makes the spell even more inflexible. And, of course, the tighter spell boundary means there is less margin for errors. So designing a working spell formula is a lot harder than designing a working invocation. Zorian waited patiently until she was finished. Not really sure why she was telling him these things. This was all basic theory that he had heard and read 1,000 times, but unwilling to interrupt. Unfortunately, it appeared he would have to wait to hear what the point of her little questioning was. Because Nora suddenly looked at the clock hanging by the door and blanched when she realized how much time had passed. Sorry. Mr. Kaczynski. I guess I got carried away. You better go to the next class before I get you in trouble, Nora said apologetically. Zorian shrugged. He had intended to skip the next class one way or another. But it probably wouldn't impress her much if he told her that. I'll need a few days to set up a schedule. So I'll tell you the details via Ilsa. We'll have a blast working together. I can already tell. He was just about to leave when she suddenly started talking again. Oh. I almost forgot. Go see Ilsa sometime today, she has something she wants to talk to you about. Something about you returning a favor you owe her for setting this up. Now why did that sound kind of ominous? Scioria's main train station was always busy. There was a sort of hurried feeling suffusing the entire area that Zorian found either annoying or invigorating, depending on his current mood. When he was disembarking from the train, it served as a metaphorical bucket of cold water to wake him up from the long sleepy journey. And he welcomed it. When he was simply standing on platform number 6, waiting for the train to arrive, it was oppressive and unwelcome. And he desperately wished he knew how to suppress it. Especially since the damned train was 2 hours late. In order to amuse himself and pass the time, he had taken to harassing the numerous pigeons and sparrows milling around the place. Not physically. Of course that would be not only childish, but would also cause people to stare at him. He was instead pushing his mana at them, trying to control them mentally. Of course. Simply pushing mana at something and wishing for it to happen wasn't enough to do real magic. But it did seem to agitate them a lot. Typically, whatever bird he was concentrating on became increasingly erratic as seconds went by before fleeing away from the area after a minute or so. Finally, the shrill whistle of the incoming train broke him out of his concentration. And the local wildlife was spared further indignation. Zorian scanned the crowd of people disembarking from the train, searching for his target. He was technically supposed to hold a sign and wait, but he was confident he could spot the guy without problem. It's not like there'd be many white-haired teenagers on the train platform. After all, it actually wasn't as bad as he'd thought it would be. This favor Ilsa had asked of him. Admittedly, helping a transfer student carry his luggage and showing him around the city would waste an entire day, but on the bright side, he was excused from attending today's classes. Besides, it would give him a legitimate excuse to approach Kale. The transfer student in question, the Morlock boy, was a bit unapproachable even at the best of days. And Zorian had been thinking of trying to befriend him. He really ought to find some friends beside Benesek. And Kale seemed like someone he could get along well with. If he turned out to be wrong, well, it's not like the Morlock would remember any awkwardness between them once the time loop reset itself again. Would he? Finally, he spotted Kale disembarking and moved towards him to help him with his luggage. It wasn't just an empty gesture of goodwill on Zorian's part. Either Kale was clearly having problems with his burden. Probably because he could only use one arm to manipulate the heavy bags. The other hand was currently supporting a little girl that clung to Kale's side like a barnacle, observing everything around her with childlike intensity. Kale was momentarily surprised when Zorian wordlessly started helping him, but quickly went along with it. The little girl clutching his side was now staring at Zorian with undisguised curiosity. And Zorian wondered who she was. Was this his little sister? Her vivid blue eyes certainly reminded him of Kale, since the Morlock had eyes of the exact same shade. But her hair was jet black, and she didn't look very much like a Morlock to Zorian. And in any case, surely the boy wouldn't bring a child this young with him. Zorian kept expecting her mother to step out of the train and take the little girl out of Kale's hands. But somehow that never happened. Finally, the last of the bags was standing on the floor and Kale finally turned towards him. "Thank you," the boy said politely. For all his aloofness, Kale was never actually rude. "I'm Kale Tveranov. I'm not normally this inept. But it's hard to handle the luggage with one hand. Kana has been rather clingy today, and I didn't have the heart to pry her off. The move was too stressful for her. I'm afraid." "It's no problem," Zorian said. "I'm here to help. After all, that's what Ilsa sent me here for." I'm Zorian Kaczynski. One of your classmates. Ilsa's a lady sent me here to help you with your luggage and show you around the city. Kale gave him a startled look. Clutching the little girl attached to his hip like Zorian was about to snatch her away. What? Zorian asked. Surprised at the alarm in the boy's posture. Was it something I said? I didn't mean to offend. Kale gave him a long, suspicious look. Before finally reaching a decision of some sort. You didn't do anything, Mr. Kaczynski. And it is I who should apologize, Kale said finally. Allow me to introduce myself again, I am Kale Tveranov. And this is my daughter, Kana. Zorian stared at the Morlock for a moment. Before glancing at his daughter. Kana gave him a shy wave. But otherwise remained silent. She was very young. Probably around 3 years of age. But Kale wasn't much older than Zorian. That would mean Kale was 13 or so at the time she was born. Ha! Talk about being a young parent. I see, he said finally. And he really did. Too. Kale probably got enough grief from people around him over being a Morlock without adding this sort of fuel to the fire. If Zorian was in his place, he would have done everything he could to keep this sort of thing from his classmates as well. If you're afraid I'll go around telling all our classmates about you having a daughter. You don't have to worry, I understand the need for discretion in matters like this. Kale breathed a sigh of relief. Thank you. Don't mention it, Zorian said. Waving him off. Considering the child's mother wasn't here with them. There was probably a very stressful story in there somewhere. He would have to be a total jackass to set the academy rumor mill on the poor guy by telling them about this. He was a little curious as to how the boy intended to watch over his daughter while attending the academy. But supposed he had already arranged for a nanny of some sort for the child. I'll just cast a quick spell to carry your luggage and then we'll be off. Zorian quickly cast the floating disc spell. And a ghostly horizontal circle flickered into existence in front of them. It was a very useful spell that they were supposed to learn in Ilsa's class somewhere in the middle of the 3rd year. But Zorian had been proactive enough to track it down in one of the restarts. It was similar to the shield spell in mechanics. But this particular force construct was mobile and optimized for supporting weight as opposed to absorbing blows. It dutifully floated after them as they started walking out of the train station. Interesting, Kale said. I must admit that. When Ilsa told me my education is severely lacking in many areas, I thought she was exaggerating. Is this what an average 3rd-year student is like? Well. No, said Zorian. I'm actually way beyond what a 3rd-year student should be. Though I'm hardly unique in my skill. Kale hummed thoughtfully. Why would your education be lacking? Anyway, asked Zorian. Kale remained silent for a few seconds. And Zorian was just about to conclude the Morlock wasn't interested in talking when the boy finally decided to answer. My education was unconventional, said Kale. I was a sort of unofficial apprentice to a village mage. One that wasn't a member of the guild. Her skills were somewhat specialized. So much of my proficiency with magic is a product of my own personal efforts. In other words, I'm largely self-taught. Zorian's respect for the other boy rose a few notches after hearing this. Magic was hard enough to learn with proper instruction. For a young boy to go at it all by himself and get far enough to join a 3rd-year class, though, if he's such a genius. I hope I'm not being too nosy. But dash. But why am I going into Scioria? Now, guessed Kale. I got a pretty good offer from the academy. And it wasn't like I had anyone stopping me from leaving. My parents died when I was young. And my teacher, she got sick during the weeping. As did my wife. Kana is the only family I have left. Zorian flinched. Oh gods. I didn't mean dash. Kale shook his head. Don't worry about it. Mr. Kaczynski. If I was to fall apart every time someone broached that topic, I would have to become a hermit and avoid people completely. It is natural to be curious about these things. Zorian still felt pretty terrible. He had pretty much assumed Kale had gotten some girl pregnant and later had to take responsibility for the child. But no. The guy had been married and everything. A bit shocking to marry and have children so young in this day and age. But hardly unheard of. He studied Kale out of the corner of his eyes in the resulting silence. The boy looked very delicate. With pale, willowy physique and gentle facial lines. Coupled with his shoulder-length white hair. It gave him a rather feminine appearance. Nonetheless, the boy clearly had no shortage of inner strength if he could move on after losing so many people to the horrible sickness. Back in Siren, there was a woman who had lost a husband and both sons to the bloody tears fever. And never managed to move past that. She had actually blamed the entire Kaczynski family for her tragedy. Claiming they had used their magic powers to curse her loved ones because of some petty disagreement. Zorian would be the first person to admit he and his family were no angels. But that was just absurd. And kind of sad. There is no need to pity me. Mr. Kaczynski, said Kale. Breaking him out of his thoughts. Oh. I don't pity you, Zorian said. I think you're very inspiring. Actually. You're a single parent who somehow managed to find the time to teach himself magic to such a degree that a world-renowned institution like the Academy in Scioria acknowledged your potential. They gave you a scholarship. Didn't they? Kale nodded. I wouldn't be able to attend otherwise. They rarely give out scholarships. You know. Zorian said. About 5 to 6 of them each year. You must be pretty amazing to have caught their attention like that. It's mostly my medical expertise, Kale sighed. I made a vow to myself after you know. I swore to myself I would become the best healer of the age and make sure a tragedy such as the weeping can never happen again. Wow. Zorian didn't know what to say to something like that. I made quite a lot of progress on that front. If you permit me to be a little immodest here. Kale said. But it's complicated. We can talk later. If you're still interested. Me and Kana are rather tired from the journey and I'd like to retire for the day. Kana especially. Zorian suddenly noticed Kana was starting to doze off on Kale's shoulder. She had been so quiet throughout his entire interaction with Kale that he had almost forgotten she's there. If only Curiel could be that docile. Yes. Sorry about that, Zorian apologized. I got carried away. I guess. I'll have to give you a tour of the city some other time. Then. They spent the rest of the walk in comfortable silence. You were absent yesterday. Zorian gave Akoja an annoyed look. She wasn't going to give him grief over that. Was she? I was excused, he noted. I know, Akoja said. I was just wondering where you were. Zorian was about to tell her it wasn't her damn business where he went in his free time. But then he reconsidered. He was getting strange vibes off Akoja. Almost as if she was concerned about him. Very strange. Normally he would write it off as just another weird thing Akoja did from time to time. The girl seemed to have logic all of her own sometimes. One that not even her obsession with rules could explain, but his recent conversation with Kale stopped him. Was he too dismissive of other people? Up until yesterday. Kale was simply that Morlock transfer student to Zorian. It brought back memories of his conversations with Zack. And the other boys' remarks about Zorian's behavior in previous restarts. Before he became aware of the time loop. I was doing a favor for Ilsa, Zorian said. Showing our newest transfer student around the city and such. Oh, Akoja said. glancing at Kale for a moment. The white-haired boy was sitting several rows behind Zorian. Silent and aloof as always. He gave virtually no indication that he knew Zorian was in the classroom. But Zorian could feel the Morlock's eyes on him from time to time. Who is he anyway? Kale Tveranov, Zorian answered. I didn't mean his name, Akoja huffed. Realizing, after a few seconds of silence, that he wasn't going to say anything else. Not sure what else to tell you, Zorian shrugged. He sounded like a good person to me. He looks kind of arrogant, Akoja remarked. And girly. Well, how judgmental of you, Zorian remarked with a frown. You come off as a bit arrogant yourself. You know. Well. So much for being nice to Akoja. She stomped off soon after that, shooting him a nasty glare. Resolving to be more understanding towards people was hard. It took Nora Boole only 2 days to organize their first lesson. And the moment Zorian stepped into the classroom Nora had reserved for them, he realized Nora was taking this very seriously. It was a professional-looking workshop. The sort that students normally couldn't access without special permission from the teachers. Nora beckoned him forward, positively radiating excitement and enthusiasm. Suddenly he remembered why he had been pensive about getting instruction from her. Considering the amount of homework and additional reading Nora assigned as a matter of course during her classes, Zorian dreaded finding out what she considered an appropriate workload for an actually talented student. Ah. You're too quiet, she complained. Courage. Zorian. Courage. Right, agreed Zorian half-heartedly. We'll make a proper crafter out of you yet. Just you see, huffed Nora. But first, let me just wrap up our discussion from last time. I was a little long-winded. But what I had been trying to build up to was that spell formula, our support. Magic. Magic affecting other magic. By itself. Even the most elegant spell formula is merely a theoretical exercise. You need to actually cast the spells and anchor them to the spell formula before it's of any use. I note this because Ilsa seemed to think your skill in invocations would do you no good in my subject. Which annoyed me because it revealed a fundamental misunderstanding about the nature of the discipline. Which is very disappointing. Coming from her. Since she is well. You know. A teacher, finished Zorian. Yeah, Nora agreed. A little awkwardly. Teachers rarely spoke ill of one another. In Zorian's experience. So it was no wonder why she was uncomfortable criticizing Ilsa in front of a student. They did have to work with one another on a regular basis. After all, and undermining other teachers' authority like that could get ugly very quickly. Fortunately, only Zorian was present in this case. And he didn't intend to make trouble for her. She seemed to realize it too. After a moment. Because she smiled and continued as if nothing had happened. Anyway, I guess we should get you started on the beginner's cube. As it turned out, the beginner's cube was a perfectly cubical block of gray stone. Each side roughly 10 centimeters long. The one Zorian was given was completely blank and smooth. But Nora showed him a couple of finished ones as a demonstration. They did things like heat up, shed light, or float in the air when activated, or when certain conditions were met. Basically, each finished cube was a crude magic item that used a couple of simple spells and a whole lot of spell formula to produce a neat little toy. They were a standard training tool. According to Nora. Zorian wanted one the moment he had laid his eyes on them. Giving such a blatantly magical toy to Curiel would probably keep her out of his hair for hours. It would be his secret weapon against her. Besides, a small floating cube would make a much more challenging target for his magic missile practice than the boulders and tree trunks he usually practiced on. Especially if he could somehow get it to dodge. He wouldn't have to wait long to acquire one. As it turned out, crafting one was the idea behind today's lesson. And not just any beginner's cube. Either. Zorian had expected Nora to give him something easy for a start. But apparently she had something a little more ambitious in mind. But those ones are too easy for you, Nora concluded. No. I have something much more fun for you to work on. Here. She handed him another cube. Though this one was positively covered with spell formula. Zorian noted with rising dread that he couldn't make heads or tails of it. Hell. Many of the sections looked like mere placeholders instead of working spell formula. Being little more than stylized pictograms. Wait. As you may have noticed. I compressed the spell formula somewhat, Nora said. Partially it's because there wasn't enough space on the cube to represent it fully in its raw form. And partially to stop you from simply copying the entire thing line by line on the blank one I gave you earlier. Isn't that the whole point? Zorian asked. For me to study a working example to see how it's done. That is. Absolutely. But I'm afraid blindly copying the spell formula from one cube to another won't teach you what I want you to learn. If I thought you needed to practice memorization and precision, I'd have you copy a dozen or so easy ones to start with. But I'm sure you're already beyond that. No one spends as much time on spell formula theory as you have without trying out some practical examples. I never encountered anything like those cubes in the texts I read, said Zorian. But yes. I have been using spell formulas from time to time. Mostly to establish an alarm perimeter around my bed. During my second year I had a really nosy roommate, and also to make some free lamps and heating plates. Invocations didn't last long. Even if a mage poured more mana into them than absolutely necessary, and there was only so much you could overpower a spell before it shattered from the strain, they inevitably degraded after a couple of hours at most. The spell boundary degraded with time and eventually fell apart. Regardless of whether the spell had enough mana left or not. As a consequence, if Zorian wanted his alarm spell to last throughout the entire night, or his makeshift lamp not to wink out every hour or so, he had to stabilize the spell boundary somehow. Spell formulas were the easiest and most reliable way to do that. So long as someone already crafted a stabilization formula for that particular spell and made it available to the public. It's not very surprising you never encountered beginner's cubes in your reading, Nora said. They're mostly used for theoretical exercises. Not very useful. Most mages don't really care how spell formulas work, only that they do. They memorize the well-documented formulas and some quick and dirty methods of modifying existing ones. And then they only have to know when to apply which one. Then they say spell formulas are dry and boring. Ha! If only they knew the true mysteries of the art. The hidden beauty of numbers and geometry. Zorian listened stoically as Nora mumbled to herself about unimaginative rabble and sleeping in the bed they made for themselves for a while. After a while she took a deep breath and plastered a pleasant smile on her face before turning her attention to him again. There was no sane teacher in this school. It seemed. Zorian wondered whether it was the stress of teaching itself that was producing these kind of effects. Or if you simply had to be crazy to accept a teaching position here. But I digress, Nora said cheerfully. I guess I should stop wasting our time and tell you what I want you to do. Here. Let me demonstrate. The cube Nora wanted Zorian to recreate was quite complicated. At its core, it was a glorified lamp using a simple torch spell as its base. It could be activated and deactivated verbally. By saying one of the several command words. And it had to be able to tell when someone was referring to it specifically. As opposed to using the command word in some other context. It had 3 different brightness settings. It conserved mana by not shedding light from any side that was covered by something the side resting on the floor didn't shine. For example. And wrapping it in a blanket would cause it to turn itself off. Each individual side could be turned on and off by tapping on it twice in quick succession. It could be keyed into a specific person, taking orders from him or her alone. Nora had told him not to worry if he couldn't duplicate it exactly. She only wanted to see how far he'd get on his own by the next time they met. That was good. Because this assignment was far more complex than anything spell formula related he had done up until now. Their next session was on Monday. So he had an entire weekend to work with. But he doubted he could fully rise to the challenge. He had mixed feelings about Nora's teaching methods. On one hand, she was taking him seriously. And that was good. On the other hand, she seemed to think that throwing a person overboard was a perfectly valid way of teaching people how to swim. Metaphorically speaking. Come in. Zorian sighed before stepping into Svim's office. What a wonderful way to end a week. For all her faults, he infinitely preferred Nora's way of teaching compared to that of Svim. Zorian Kaczynski. Sit down. Please, Svim ordered. Not even bothering to wait for an answer. Zorian caught the pen the man had thrown at him with practiced ease. And then promptly caused it to float off the palm of his hand, gently spinning in the air. Whoops. He hadn't meant to do that. Oh well. Let's see what the man will say about that. Make it glow, Svim barked out without skipping a beat. Completely unfazed by Zorian's skill. Zorian wasn't even surprised anymore. The pen promptly snapped back to his hand and erupted in soft ghostly glow. He cycled through various colors without prompting from Svim, occasionally changing the intensity of the light just to prove he could. Svim arched his eyebrow at him. I didn't say you could stop levitating the pen. Zorian's lips twitched in an aborted smile. If Svim thought he would stump him with that, he was very much mistaken. Combining two different shaping exercises was an obvious thing to do. And Zorian had already tried it. Moments later, the pen was spinning in the air in front of him. Glowing. Svim tapped his finger on the desk thoughtfully. Was it possible? Had he really managed to give the man pause? The world was coming to an end. Zorian watched in anticipation, wondering what the crazy man would think up next. I suppose there is no point in testing your ability to burn things. That was always the easiest exercise of the three, Svim mused. As a point of fact, Zorian was a bit deficient in the burning exercise, at least compared to the other two. Not that he was going to tell that to Svim. Of course. Your essentials are adequate. Almost decent. Though not quite. Your attitude could use some work. But I suppose you at least have more tact than most of the unfortunates that haunt these halls. Plus, Miss Salady has appealed to me on your behalf, asking me to be not such a hardest towards you. As such, as much as I'd like to shake up your woefully shaky foundations, I'm going to reluctantly move on to something slightly more advanced. To Zorian's great confusion, Svim handed him a strip of cloth. What was he supposed to do with that? Air. It's a blindfold, Svim explained. You put it over your eyes so you can't see. And why do I need a blindfold again? Zorian asked. We're going to train your ability to sense mana, said Svim. You're going to put the blindfold on. And then I'm going to throw these mana-charged marbles at you. Zorian stared at the man incredulously. Had he really heard him right? I'm either going to throw them over your left shoulder, over your right shoulder, or straight at your head. If you get hit by a marble, you lose a point. If you move when you don't have to, you lose a point. Otherwise you receive a point. We'll stop when you accrue 10 points or our time runs out. Yes. He really had heard him right. Thank you so much for your help, Ilsa. Thank you so much. The next 2 weeks were busy, but routine. He directed most of his efforts towards mastering spell formulas. Largely because Nora was very willing to indulge him the harder he tried in their lessons. The more enthusiastic she became about teaching him. She even suggested they meet on Sundays for additional instruction. Apparently not having any private obligations to distract her. He had learned much. But Nora set a grueling pace. And he was glad the restart was fast approaching. He doubted he could last much more than a month of Nora's teaching. Interestingly, he seemed to be attracting attention from the teachers and students alike in this particular restart. Maybe it was him impressing Ilsa as much as he did. Maybe it was the way he quietly went with the insane workload Nora gave him. Or maybe Svim said something nice about him to the other teachers. Well, probably not that last part. Since he had made little progress in mastering Svim's current exercise. In any case, he was getting a lot of attention for his efforts. Which was rather curious. Most of the time. No matter how hard he tried in class. Everyone was pretty flat about it. He thought about trying to leverage all that attention into something useful. But he was too exhausted by his studies to plot properly. Some other restart perhaps. Akoja was extremely pleased with him. Though Zorian couldn't really understand why. But she was. And then it happened. Suddenly. Without any warning. There was a wrenching sensation and everything went black. He woke up. As usual. With Kiriel lying on top of him. Looking smug. There were two possibilities that Zorian could think of to explain this occurrence. The first one was that something or someone had killed him so fast he was dead before he realized it. He was skeptical of this. As he had done nothing to warrant an assassination. And he couldn't think of any natural force that could kill so suddenly and thoroughly. He hadn't even felt any pain before he died. The second possibility was much more likely. And also much more worrying. While he was minding his business. Learning spell formulas in Scioria. Zack was off somewhere in the world. Doing insanely dangerous things. Zack died. When he did. His soul was dragged into the past to start over and it dragged Zorian's soul back with it. Which would make Zorian soul bonded to Zack. Damn it. Zorian stomped into his room. Closing the door behind him with way more force than necessary. He should have known he wouldn't find out anything about soul bonds that he hadn't already known. But it was still annoying to come back empty-handed after spending an entire day in the library. The books all repeated the same warnings he received back in his first year. Soul bonds were a dangerous and poorly understood branch of magic. Capable of causing some pretty horrifying side effects if used recklessly. Every once in a while. Some ill-informed couple decide that soul bonding themselves together would be the most romantic thing ever. Only for everything to end up in tears and lawsuits a few months later when complications surface. The main issue was that one of the participants usually started to mentally and spiritually dominate the other. Making them more like themselves in mind and soul. Not to mention disturbingly obedient and deferential. This was a good thing when binding animals as familiars. Since it was almost always the animal that got dominated by the human. And animals actually tended to benefit from such domination by developing higher intelligence and better control over their magical abilities, if they had any. Sentient beings usually had issues with someone magically subverting their entire personality and worldview. However, at least until the soul bond finished. Turning them into a servile clone. That is. Zorian ran a trembling hand through his hair and started to clean his glasses with the hem of his shirt to calm himself down. He really hoped he was wrong and that there was no soul bond between him and Zack. Zack had 6 times larger mana reserves than Zorian's theoretical maximum. Was naturally more outgoing and confident. And thanks to being in the time loop far longer than Zorian was probably decades older than him too. No points for guessing who'd be the dominant one between the two of them. Yeah. He was totally screwed. He took a couple of deep breaths and put his glasses back on. Maybe he was looking at things too fatalistically. Considering the sheer size of disparity between him and Zack, he should have experienced some pretty massive personality shifts by now. And he didn't notice anything of the sort. He certainly wasn't feeling submissive towards anyone. Least of all Zack. Obviously things weren't as bad as they seemed. He could very well be overreacting and overlooking some other perfectly reasonable explanation for the unscheduled restart. Someone was knocking. Who could possibly? Oh. Right. Taven. He sighed heavily. Just what he needed right now. The knocking turned into banging, prompting him to finally open the door. Hi. Roach. Hi. Taven, Zorian said in a slightly suffering tone. How nice of you to visit me. Do you want to come in? Taven promptly did what she always did once he let her inside. She jumped on his bed and made herself comfortable. Zorian shrugged and went after her. Best to get it over with quickly. Didn't you graduate? He asked. You said you were going to go into exploration after you graduate. What happened to that? She gave him a sour look. It's not that simple. No expedition is going to take a complete beginner like me with them. I need an established explorer to take me as an apprentice. I'm working on it. Funny. I heard you're working as a class assistant to Nurthak, Zorian remarked. Isn't that going to interfere with searching for another master? Well. Sort of, she admitted. But I'm not literally searching for another job at this point. I'm actually trying to build up my reputation and get people to notice me by doing missions and such. In fact, that's what I came to talk to you about. I'd like you to join me and a couple of others on a job tomorrow. Sounds suspicious, Zorian said. What could a measly third year help you with? Fill out our numbers. Taven answered. We can't take the job until there are 4 or more of us. And we're 1 short of that. Well. Why does the job require 4 people? Asked Zorian. Knowing from previous restarts that this was the fastest avenue to shut down Taven's excuses. Surely the employer didn't put that there just to be mean to groups like yours. It's supposedly dangerous, Taven huffed, folding her arms across her chest. The old man is overreacting. The spiders aren't even that big from what he told us. Spiders? Prodded Zorian. Yeah, Taven said hesitantly. Apparently realizing she probably shouldn't have mentioned that. Spiders. You know. Hairy 8-legged dash. Taven, Zorian warned. Oh come on. Roach. I'm begging you. Taven whined. I swear it's not as dangerous as it sounds. We've been in the tunnels hundreds of times and it wasn't that dangerous at all. We can protect you easily. Hundreds of times? Asked Zorian dubiously. Well. A dozen times at least, she relented. Zorian was just about to tell her no. Like he usually did at this point. But then he stopped himself. He probably wouldn't be able to do anything remotely productive for at least a week. What with the possibility of a soul bond between him and Zack weighing heavily on his mind and all. A nice distracting stroll through the sewers might be just what the doctor ordered. So to speak. Sure, he said. Really, she squealed. Yes. Really, confirmed Zorian. Just tell me where to meet you tomorrow before I change my mind. A few minutes later Taven left. Thanking him profusely and kissing him on the cheek for being a friend before running off to wherever she had been going. He supposed. He didn't ask. Being too shocked by her kiss. Innocuous as it may have been. He was a bit angry at himself for being so affected by a silly kiss on the cheek. But he supposed he shouldn't be too hard on his subconscious. She was his former crush. After all, he decided he had had enough of everything for the day and drank one of the sleeping potions he kept in his stash. Hopefully things would seem clearer after a good night's rest. The next morning he woke up a bit more level-headed than he had been after his visit to the library. And things didn't seem as hopeless as they had the day before. He had been jumping to conclusions. And needed more information. He was tempted to skip classes for the day to have another go at the library. But he suspected that he lacked both the research skills and the access level to properly tackle a restricted topic like soul bonds. And besides, there was someone in his class he absolutely had to talk to. Brian. The guy with a fire drake familiar. Surely someone who is already soul bonded to another. Even if it was to a magical animal instead of another human. Could tell him more about those blasted things. I see your family has given you a fire drake of your own, he said conversationally. Sitting down beside Brian and ignoring the threatening hissing of the fire drake. For some reason, the ill-tempered beast never saw fit to attack him in previous restarts. So he didn't think it would start now. Is he your familiar already? Yes, Brian confirmed. Clearly pleased with that. I bonded with him just this summer actually. A bit strange. At first. But I think I'm getting the hang of it. Strange? Asked Zorian. How so? Well, it's mostly the bond being there. You know. Brian said. So the bond can be felt? Zorian said speculatively. Trying not to let his excitement show. He didn't feel anything. Is that normal? Can everyone who is soul bonded feel their bond? No. Not everyone, Brian chuckled. Only a tiny minority can. And nobody is sure why. I can. Though. I guess I'm lucky that way. Zorian suppressed a scowl. He had been hoping that him not being able to sense any bonds meant there was none. But apparently that was no proof. Damn. You know, Zorian tried. I've always had an academic interest in familiars and soul bonds. Thankfully. Brian didn't find Zorian's interest in any way suspicious and was happy to indulge Zorian's curiosity. What Brian told him was interesting. To say the least. According to Brian, the soul bond spell was actually a ritual of some sort. One that took at least 10 minutes to properly cast. And usually more. Not something you cast as a regular invocation. Also, even the most oblivious of participants tended to feel something after a few weeks. After the bond had properly anchored itself to the participants. There were a lot of things Zorian had experienced so far in the time loop that could qualify as signs of a developing soul bond. But it was hard to say how much of that was simply a consequence of the crazy situation he had found himself in. The effects were just too weak compared to what Brian told him should happen. His mana reserves were slightly larger than they had been at the start of the time loop. For instance. But the increase was nothing special. It could just as easily be a consequence of his regular combat magic practice instead of being caused by the soul bond trying to twist his soul to be more in line with Zack's. The spell that the Lich cast on them definitely wasn't a ritual either, but then again. It was a Lich. Who knew what kind of magic a creature like that had at its disposal? All in all, it would appear he was lucky the link between him and Zack was either very weak or of a different type. Or perhaps it was only half-formed. According to Brian, the bond required physical proximity and a lot of personal interaction between participants to fully mature. It was why he carried his fire drake everywhere he went at this point in time. Considering he only interacted with Zack in one of the restarts so far. And that the boys spent virtually all of the restarts away from Cyoria. The bond may have never gotten the chance to solidify. If so, he must never allow it to fully form. He would avoid contact with the other time traveler from now on until he could figure out more about what was happening. Which, admittedly, Could take a while. Hopefully his idea of avoiding Zack as much as possible would keep him from being overwhelmed by the bond in the meantime. He really ought to make a learning plan for himself. So far, he had been learning things rather haphazardly. There was no hurry. As far as he knew. And he didn't know where to begin anyway. Also, he had wanted to grow a little as a mage before breaking out of the time loop. Since he would never get an opportunity like this again. That kind of disorganized approach was no longer appropriate. However, he wanted the soul bond broken as soon as possible. And that meant finding a way out of the time loop as quickly as possible. But that would have to wait for another time. Because he had a meeting with Taven and her friends scheduled for the evening. Why did he agree to this again? Oh yes. Taven picked a really inconvenient moment and he had a momentary bout of insanity. He should have at least gotten some favor out of her for doing this. Oh well. Live and learn. Taven had chosen an annoyingly distant meeting place. So Zorian had a long trek across in front of him. Apparently there was a meeting spot for chess players in one of Sioria's parks. And one of Taven's friends was a regular visitor. He never actually visited that particular park. But the path towards it was somewhat familiar and he couldn't figure out why. He realized why it was familiar a few minutes later when he stumbled on a small bridge just inside the park. This was where he had met that crying little girl whose bicycle fell into the stream. Back before he was aware of the time loop. Come to think of it. He never visited this place after that. Did he? There just wasn't any reason to. Since he knew in advance there were obstacles blocking his path if he went this way. He peered curiously at the section of the creek beneath the bridge. Trying to see if the bike was still there. Unsurprisingly, it wasn't. Yesterday's heavy rain had swelled the creek into a raging torrent. And the bicycle was, no doubt, picked up by the currents and swept along. The little girl wasn't there this time. Of course. But that didn't mean he was alone on the bridge. There was a smallish cat. Probably a very young one. Looking forlornly at the raging waters of the stream. Zorian didn't generally stress himself about the plight of animals. But when the cat turned to look at him and their eyes met, he was assaulted by an intense feeling of sadness and loss. Unnerved by the experience, he picked up his pace, hurriedly leaving the strange cat behind him. Finally, after nearly 30 minutes of wandering the park, he found the meeting place. Taven should really learn how to give proper directions one of these days. It was a rather peaceful place, though populated almost entirely by old people. As in, really old people. Taven's group of teenagers stuck out like a sore thumb. But none of the old geezers surrounding them seemed to mind, so Zorian decided not to let it bother him and cautiously approached. Taven's other friends were a pair of gruff, muscular boys that looked more at home in the boxing ring than in a mage school. One of them was currently frowning at the chessboard in front of him, contemplating his next move. While Taven and the other boys sat on each side of him. Taven was clearly impatient and bored out of her skull. At one point actually trying to snatch a figurine from the board to pass the time with. Only to get foiled by the players. The other boy was more relaxed. Lazily observing everything around him like a guard dog. It was this other boy who noticed him and pointed him out to the other two. Roach. Taven waved. Thank the gods. I was starting to fear you'd never show up. I wasn't late, Zorian protested. Well, you sure developed a habit of cutting it close since the last time we saw each other, she accused. But anyway. Roach. I'd like you to meet my two minions. Grunt and Mumble. Grunt. Mumble. This is my good friend Roach. Zorian rolled his eyes. At least it's not just him who gets a stupid nickname. Damn it. I told you not to introduce us like that. One of the boys protested. It was more out of force of habit than because he honestly expected Taven to change. If Zorian was reading things correctly. He sighed and turned toward Zorian. Hi. Kid. I'm Yurik. And the guy playing chess is Oren. Thanks for helping us out like this. We'll make sure nothing happens to you. So don't worry about anything. The chess player grunted. Possibly in agreement. That must be grunt. Then. I'm Zorian, he spoke back. The guy never told him their last names. So why should he tell them his? Right, said Taven enthusiastically. Introductions are over. So let's get going. Shall we? Not until I finish this round, the chess player said flatly. Taven's shoulders slumped in defeat. I hate that game, Taven whined. Find yourself a seat. Roach. This could take a while. Zorian clacked his tongue in annoyance. For once Zorian empathized with Taven's impatience. He wasn't a big fan of chess either. The dungeon was an extremely dangerous place. Also known as the underworld. The labyrinth. And a million other names. It was a staggeringly extensive network of caves and tunnels that ran beneath the surface of the world. At first glance, the place seemed like every mage's dream come true. Ambient mana levels increased the deeper one descended into the endless depths of the dungeon cave system. And the lower levels were practically swimming with useful minerals with fantastic magical properties. Unfortunately, mages were just one of the many creatures that thrived in such an environment. Monsters of all sorts lived in the tunnels. And the deeper one went, the stronger and more alien they became. Even the greatest of archmages had to take care not to go too deep when exploring the dungeon. Lest they come face to face with something they had no hope of defeating. Scioria, like many other cities, took advantage of the dungeon beneath it when the city was being built. The topmost portion of the dungeon was cleared of anything aggressive or particularly dangerous and then systematically walled off from the deeper levels. These tunnels were then modified into shelters, storage spaces, flood control systems, and the city sewer system. Human settlements had used the dungeon as a sewer for so long that several species of oozes and other monsters adapted specifically to take advantage of this unique ecological niche. And humans often transplanted them from one city to the next when they built new settlements. Of course, the separation of this topmost layer from the deeper parts of the dungeon was never 100% effective, especially since many dungeon denizens were very capable diggers. Regular maintenance was required to keep the whole thing functioning properly. Scioria's dungeon boundary was widely known to have more holes than a sponge. It was a fairly young city. And the local dungeon was particularly extensive. It grew too big. Too fast. And a proper separation between layers was never finalized. That was probably why the invaders managed to smuggle an entire army of monsters into the city by having them pour straight out of the tunnels, though how exactly the invaders mapped out the deep dungeon well enough to find a route big enough for an army to pass through is anyone's guess. Just one more example of how ridiculously well prepared the enemy was. Zorian supposed. Despite the obvious danger, Zorian wasn't too worried about following Taven into the tunnels. Scioria's underground wasn't the safest place in the world. But it was by no means a certain death sentence either. And he doubted the invaders were currently in there. Since a giant army of monsters living just beneath the city was absolutely impossible to hide. Regardless of how good the invasion organizers were, they would have to navigate their route on the day of the invasion to avoid detection. He would feel better if he had a focusing item for his combat magic. Of course. But that was beyond his reach at this point. Nora's tutoring aside, he still wasn't good enough with spell formulas to make one from scratch. And he couldn't buy one without a permit. Unfortunately, their employer didn't seem to share Zorian's confidence. "This is the fourth member you found," the old man demanded incredulously. Did he even graduate yet? Zorian looked at the scowling man waving towards him in a dismissive manner and promptly decided he could understand Taven's irritation with the guy. If the guy was so worried about their ability to deliver results, why didn't he hire an actual professional to recover his damn watch? Oh. That's right, he didn't want to pay a professional's wage. Frankly, Taven and her group were probably the best he could hope to get, considering where he looked for help. The job itself was simple enough. The old man lost a pocket watch in the tunnels while fleeing from a duo of giant spiders. And now they had to get it back. The old man tried to retrieve it. But when he came back to the spot where he had dropped it, it was no longer there. Personally, Zorian was sure it was eaten by an ooze or some other metal-eating scavenger living in the tunnels. But the old man insisted it was still intact and in the spider's possession. How he knew that was anyone's guess. What would a bunch of spiders, giant or otherwise, do with a watch? Were they like magpies, collecting shiny items just because? Nope, Zorian said, completely unrepentant. I'm a third year. A third year, the man squawked. And you think you can survive down there? Do you even know any combat magic? Sure do, confirmed Zorian immediately. Magic missile, shield and flamethrower. That's all. You get what you pay for, Zorian shrugged. Look. What's your problem? Taven interrupted. It's 4 of us versus 2 large-ish spiders. I alone would be enough for that. Just because I only encountered 2 doesn't mean there isn't more of them, the man grunted. I don't want you to stumble on a whole hive of those things and get slaughtered. Those things are fast and stealthy. I didn't even notice them until they were right on top of me. I'm lucky to be alive. Talking to you 4. Well, there's 4 pair of eyes among us, Taven reasoned. We'll watch each other's backs. So good luck on them sneaking up on us. I don't suppose you'll finally tell us what's so important about that watch you lost. It's none of your business, the man shot back. It's not valuable or anything. I just have sentimental reasons for wanting it back. He shook his head. I suppose the kid is right. I got what I could, considering the reward I'm offering. Just don't get careless. I don't want the lives of a bunch of children weighing on my soul when I finally die. A few minutes and a whole lot of pointless bickering later, Taven finally led them all towards the nearby dungeon entrance. There were guards stationed there, but Taven had a permit to go in and could bring people with her. So they were free to pass. That was reassuring. At least it meant someone in the permit office considered Taven capable enough to keep relative non-combatants like himself safe down there. Apparently she hadn't been talking completely out of her ass when she had said she could protect him. The tunnels themselves were a lot less sinister than Zorian imagined. Or at least this particular section was smooth stone walls, nothing more threatening than rats wandering around. The stone covering the corridors reflected light pretty well. So the 4 floating lanterns they had hovering above them, Taven insisted they all cast one and spaced them away from each other, so they wouldn't be immediately plunged into darkness on the off chance they encountered something that could dispel them, illuminated the tunnels quite nicely. Unfortunately, there was no sign of either the missing watch or the giant spiders. Taven seemed to think it would be easy to track down the spiders with a simple locate creature spell, and was stumped when the spell and all other divinations she tried, for that matter, came out empty. As it turned out, Taven and her 2 friends were more than a little specialized in combat magic, and didn't have the faintest idea how to go about tracking down either the watch or the spiders once their rudimentary divination attempts failed. Eventually they settled on just wandering around, hoping they'd stumble on the spider's lair, occasionally repeating the divinations with no effect. After about 2 hours of that, Zorian was ready to call it quits. He was just about to suggest they give up and come back tomorrow, when he suddenly felt very, very sleepy. Being a mage required a great deal of mental discipline. Shaping mana correctly required focus and ability to visualize the desired result with crystal clarity. As such, all mages were, to an extent, resistant to mind magic and other effects targeting the mind. It was the only reason why Zorian was still awake and desperately fighting the sleep spell, instead of collapsing on the ground in deep slumber. In front of him he saw Taven and one of her friends sway on the spot as they tried to resist the spell as well, while the other boy already laid sprawled on the floor. He struggled with the spell for a second or two, and then the sleep effect just withdrew. Before he could do anything, he was forced on his knees by a stream of memories and images that bored themselves directly into his mind. Confusion. A memory of him staring at a particularly baffling spell formula problem, tapping his pen against the table in frustration. An image of two floating balls of water connected by a collection of ever-shifting streams of water flowing from one orb to another. An alien memory of a war troll tearing through delicate white walls that seemed to be made solely out of cobwebs. A question. "Are you Dash?" the voice boomed in his mind, before collapsing into another psychedelic collection of images and alien memories. The deluge lessened for a moment, as if waiting for a response. Then it started again. Frustration. "I thought Dash, brotherhood. Web stretching across lightless chasms. Orbs of light trapped within them. Don't understand me. Do you?" Sadness. Pity. More frustration. Resignation. The flow of images abruptly stopped assaulting his mind. Zorian clutched his head to lessen the raging headache pulsing inside his head and looked around. Taven and her two friends were unconscious, but appeared to be unharmed. There was no trace of their attacker anywhere. He tried to wake them up, but they wouldn't budge. Deciding the best idea would be to get back to the surface before something decided to finish them off. Zorian promptly cast the floating disc spell and piled his three unconscious teammates on top of it before making a beeline towards the dungeon entrance. He just hoped his head would stop killing him by tomorrow. Zorian woke up very confused. A part of him was wondering what he was doing in a hospital, of all things, while another part was surprised he hadn't woken up back in Siren with Curiel wishing him a good morning, just like every time he started over. A few seconds later his mind cleared up and he remembered what had happened yesterday. He didn't start over because he hadn't died in the tunnels, he just had his mind scrambled. This was actually far more worrying than merely dying, since any damage to his mind carried over across restarts. But it would seem he didn't suffer any permanent damage. He vaguely remembered the doctor concluding the same when he was brought in yesterday, before shoving him into this room and telling him to sleep it off. Some doctor. He didn't need a hospital for that. He wondered how Taven and her two friends were faring. They had been still completely comatose when he had stumbled out of the dungeon entrance and the guards had rushed them all to the nearest hospital. "Finally awake, I see," Ilsa said from the doorway. "Do you feel up to talking or should I come back later?" "Miss Salady?" Zorian asked. "What are you doing here?" "As our student. The Academy is obliged to represent you in legal matters," Ilsa said, approaching his bed. "This qualifies. How are you feeling?" "I'm fine," Zorian shrugged. He didn't even have a headache anymore. "I might as well go home once you finish questioning me." "Questioning you?" Ilsa asked. "It sounds almost sinister, the way you say it. Why would I be questioning you?" "Air." "Well," Zorian fumbled. "The police tend to be hard asses towards witnesses in my experience. Just in case they're hiding something and all that." For a moment Zorian thought she would ask him where he got that kind of experience with the police. But she instead just shook her head and chuckled. "Well, I'm not the police," Ilsa said. Though I did come to ask you what happened. Your friends don't remember anything substantial. Having been hit with that sleep spell right at the start of the attack. Are they alright? Zorian asked. Yes, Ilsa confirmed. They woke up yesterday with no ill effects. Your injuries were far more serious. Medically speaking. She gave him a wry smile. I think it was their pride that was hurt the most. A third year resisted a spell they could not and saved their lives. Sioria's dungeon boundary is infamously porous. If it weren't for you, they probably would have been dead by morning. Zorian looked away uncomfortably. Is that why Taven had never contacted him after that initial invitation to go with her at the start of each restart? He thought she was being callous. How did he resist that sleep spell? Though. If Taven and her two friends didn't. And what happened afterwards? It hurt. And it was unpleasant. But he had a feeling it wasn't an attack. His attacker could have finished him off at any particular time but chose not to. The words. The images, it was as if something was trying to talk to him but didn't know how to communicate with humans properly. Considering the number of webs in the alien memories he had been bombarded with. It was probably the spiders. He never heard of any sentient spiders with access to mind magic. Though. I'm not really sure what happened, Zorian finally said. After the sleep spell failed. I was immediately bombarded by a barrage of images that almost made me black out. It was very painful and disorienting. After it stopped, I tried to get my bearings to respond to further attacks. But after a minute or so I realized none were coming and decided to hightail out of there. I have no idea why the attackers stopped. Ilsa hummed. There are lots of possibilities. Maybe. Instead of walking into a deliberate ambush, you simply stumbled upon someone who didn't want to be seen and they moved to incapacitate you so they could slip away unnoticed. Maybe someone left a spell trap in that section of the tunnels for whatever reason and you set off the trigger. Maybe you resisting 2 spells in a row intimidated them into leaving. We may never know. I guess. Yes. All valid possibilities. It certainly wasn't giant sentient telepathic spiders. No sir. Oh, and Zorian. Ilsa continued. You're forbidden from going down in the tunnels until further notice. I get that you wanted to help a friend. But it was still a foolish thing to do. Yes, Professor, Zorian agreed. Understood. 10 minutes after Ilsa left, the nurse came to tell him he could go home. This is boring. Taven complained. Zorian cracked one of his eyes open so he could glare at her. You said you wanted to make it up to me, he reminded. But I meant teaching you some kick-ass spells. Not, she scowled at the bowl full of marbles in front of her. Throwing marbles over your shoulders. Shouldn't I at least aim a couple at your forehead? I bet you'd be a lot more motivated to get it right that way. If you do that, I'm going to track you down to your room and suffocate you in your sleep, Zorian threatened heatedly. The whole reason he was having her do this was so that he could practice this stupid trick without suffering through Svim's methods. He closed his eyes and took a deep breath. After a few seconds he felt the mana-charged marble pass in the vicinity of his face but couldn't pinpoint over which shoulder it flew. Left, he tried. No. Right, Taven. Now you're just guessing. Aren't you? Just give it a rest for today. You're not going to get anywhere once you get frustrated. No. I just need a couple of minutes to calm down, Zorian sighed. Taven groaned in response and he opened both eyes so he could properly glare at her. Why are you being so difficult about this? Anyway. You know I can't ask anyone else to do this for me. Right? I don't know anyone else who can aim their throws precisely enough. And none of them could keep charging marbles for more than half an hour without depleting their reserves. I know. Taven sighed. And I'm glad you asked me for help. It's the least I could do after, well, You know. But you're not taking advantage of me properly. Zorian raised an eyebrow. That came out wrong, Taven chuckled nervously. What I meant was, I can do much more than this. My accurate marble throwing skills aren't my only gift. I know I must seem pretty pathetic for getting knocked out by a single spell, but come on. I never thought of you as pathetic because of that. Taven, Zorian sighed. But all right. What can the great Taven do for me? Teach you how to fight. Of course, she grinned. The magical way. I hope, Zorian remarked warningly. You should never underestimate the usefulness of a fist to the face. Even in a magical duel, Taven grunted. But yes. I meant the magical way. Were you telling the truth when you told the old guy who hired us you can cast magic missile? Shield and flamethrower? Of course, Zorian said. Well. Let's see them, Taven said. Waving towards a duo of dummies on the other side of the room. Won't your parents mind if I wreck their training dummies? Zorian asked. She rolled her eyes. The whole reason I told you to come to my place was so we could train here. The whole room is warded. And those dummies especially. You won't even scratch them. Trust me. Shrugging. Zorian quickly cast a magic missile. Shaping it into a piercer and weaving a homing function into it so it would hit the head of the dummy. The bolt of force sped across the room and struck the dummy square in the forehead. The faceless wooden head of the dummy bent backwards with the force of the blow in a manner that would snap a real human's neck in several places. But then promptly snapped back to its default position as if nothing was wrong. A decent magic missile, Taven praised. I like that you can cast one without a spell focus. I thought that would be the first thing I would have to teach you. Her hands blurred in a dizzying display of skill. The chant spoken so softly he barely even heard it. A veritable swarm of magic missiles erupted from her hands. Speeding towards the dummy with a lot more speed than Zorian's piercer had and impacting it with enough force to lift it off its feet and smash it into the wall behind it. Though they were simply smashers. Zorian knew they were a lot more dangerous than the piercer he had produced. Even individually. She didn't appear the slightest bit strained by the effort to produce the display. So was there any purpose for doing that? Other than rubbing in how far beyond me you are? Zorian inquired. Firing that many magic missiles, even sequentially, would drain my reserves dry on the spot. I don't think I'll be repeating your feat anytime soon. Really? Taven asked. I guess I kind of assumed your mana reserves are huge. Like your brother's. How many magic missiles can you cast in one sitting? 11, Zorian said. Pointedly ignoring her first remark. It started out as 8. But I increased it somewhat. 8. Taven gaped. But that's practically below average. Zorian knew nothing good would come out of blowing up at her. It was Taven. She didn't really think before speaking. And if you were bothered by that you had no business interacting with her. Does that mean you admit defeat and we should get back to the marbles? He asked with deceptive cheer. No, she shrieked. No. I was just surprised. That's all. I sort of wanted to teach you how to cast multiple magic missiles with one casting. But I suppose it wouldn't do you much good with such tiny mana reserves. You should make your every spell count instead of going for quantity. Show me your shield and flamethrower while I think of something. After trying to burn a dummy to a crisp and failing, Zorian cast a quick shield. Thinking just its existence would be enough of a proof for Taven. Apparently not. As she immediately whipped out a spell rod out of her belt and fired a smallish purple projectile at the shield. Zorian's eyes widened at the unexpected attack. But the attack splashed harmlessly against the semi-transparent plane of force and dissipated into a puff of purple smoke that soon disappeared without a trace entirely. What the hell was that? Zorian demanded. I was just checking if the shield can hold, Taven told him. The spell is harmless. Just a simple coloring bolt that carries some force to it. Zorian wanted to tell her his shield held against a hostile mage that was actually trying to kill him. But he couldn't really do that. He settled on giving her an annoyed look. Eventually, Taven admitted she couldn't think of anything at the moment and reluctantly started throwing marbles over his shoulders again. She made it clear to him, however, that she would enlist help from her parents in the coming days. And that this way of training was a one-time thing. Zorian managed to negotiate at least an hour of marble throwing each session. In addition to whatever crazy scheme she would come up with eventually. Truthfully, combat magic was only a side interest at the moment. He was starting to realize he couldn't keep blundering blindly through this. As much as he had wanted to advance his magical studies before finding the exit, he couldn't simply ignore the danger posed by the possibility of a soul bond the longer he stayed inside. The bigger the chance of the bond activating in full force and devouring his will and personality. The mental assault he recently went through simply highlighted that the time loop had its own dangers. And that it was irresponsible to take them lightly. A rough plan was forming in his head. He needed to find out everything he could about the time loop, how it came to be, how it functioned exactly, and how he could get out of it. Also, what was the nature of his connection to Zack? And what was the deal with the invasion? It seemed too conveniently timed to be a coincidence. So what was its connection with the time loop? Finding answers to those questions would require skills in divination, information gathering, and infiltration. So that's where the bulk of his efforts should focus on. He still intended to learn other things too, of course. But these three things were a must and a priority. He would have to finish his semi-apprenticeship in the library and learn all the tricks of that trade he could within the constraints of the time loop. The Academy Library was an incredible resource to have. And he was sure he would have to use it extensively if he was to find answers to the questions that were plaguing him. So far his attempts to use it had not yielded much in the way of results. But that was probably a consequence of insufficient authorization and lack of research skill on his part than an actual void of information on the topics in question. He needed to know how to bypass the protections on the secure sections of the library. And how to search them efficiently once he got through. And Kirathishli and Ibury were his best shot in getting there. He would apply for the job in the library first thing tomorrow morning. And, though it was too late for that in this particular restart, he should impress Ilsa again and choose divination as his interest this time. If Ilsa's choice was even halfway as motivated as Norabul was, he would have a particularly easy avenue on learning that otherwise tricky subject. And then, as he was climbing the stairs inside his apartment building, everything went black and he woke up via Kiri jumping on him and wishing him good morning. Apparently Zack died again. Only a few days into the restart this time. 2. Hopefully Zack would get the hang of whatever he was attempting very soon. Because being wrenched without warning into another restart could get old really fast. He would soon learn he should really stop tempting fate with such thoughts.